He mocked her family farm as nothing but worthless dirt, barely worth the taxes, a burden to be sold and forgotten. But when she uncovered her grandfather's coded ledger, a sealed cistern, and a limestone vault hidden beneath the east field, everything changed. What her husband laughed off as fantasy turned into crates stamped with a vanished bank's insignia, holding bonds, certificates, and coins worth $50 million. She never wanted riches, only to honor her family's memory. What would you do if the land everyone called worthless revealed it had been guarding a fortune all along? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The kettle rattled faintly on the back burner, its whistle not quite formed, the sound filling the silence of the kitchen where words often cut deeper than any blade. The table was scarred oak, older than both of them, and its surface still bore the faint rings from coffee cups set down by her grandfather long before she inherited the place. She ran a finger across those marks, grounding herself in the knowledge of who had once sat here, who had once believed this farm meant something. Across from her, her husband leaned back in his chair, one boot heel propped against the leg of the table, a smirk tugging at his mouth as he unfolded the latest tax bill. "Worthless," he said, shaking the paper as if it might shed dust. "You hear me? This land's worth nothing but headaches, dirt and weeds, and bills stacked higher than those rotting fence posts out back." His voice carried the tone of a man who thought laughter was a weapon, each word dipped in ridicule before being thrown across the table. He tapped the paper with the back of his hand. "We're paying more in taxes than we could ever make selling corn or soybeans off these acres. And you know it." She didn't argue, not immediately. Years of marriage had taught her the futility of sparring with sarcasm. Instead, she watched the kettle sway and pictured her grandfather's hands, cracked, strong, steady, folding seed packets in spring, mending tools in winter, always believing in the soil even when storms and blight had mocked him too. The memory steadied her, but only slightly. Her husband leaned forward now, lowering his voice in mock patience. "Face it, Claire, this farm is nothing but a money pit. You got sentiment, sure, but sentiment doesn't pay the tax assessor. Sentiment doesn't patch roofs or fix barns sagging into the earth. It doesn't stop those fields from choking on weeds. You want to know the real value of this place? Zero. Less than zero. You ought to thank me for being willing to shoulder this burden as long as I have." She flinched, though only inwardly. The farm had been hers before the marriage, her family's for more than a century, but he always spoke as if he'd save her from it, as though marrying her had meant dragging her out of some doomed legacy. The words wore grooves in her, like water-carving stone. He had been repeating them for years, always with the same mocking grin, always in this kitchen where her grandmother once set pies to cool and her grandfather counted the coins he earned from each harvest. The kettle finally whistled, a sharp note breaking the heavy air. She rose, poured water into 2 mugs, and slid one toward him. He didn't thank her. He never did. Instead, he leaned back again, shaking his head. "You know what we should do? Sell it off to developers. Let them carve it up into lots. Put up houses, gas stations, strip malls. That's all this land is good for now. Folks want convenience, not some story about your granddaddy's plow lines." Her hands trembled slightly as she set her own cup down. She traced the rim with her thumb, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of seeing her anger. He mistook her silence for agreement, as he often did, and pressed his advantage. "You keep clinging to this place like it's some treasure chest, but it's not. It's a corpse, and you're the only one pretending it's alive. You ever stop to wonder why your parents didn't keep it up? Why your brothers and sisters all moved away and left you holding the bag? Because they knew it's worthless dirt." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw not just a man in front of her, but the reflection of every insult she had endured since they'd married. The dismissals, the smirks, the rolling eyes whenever she spoke of her family's past. He had no reverence for soil, no respect for history. To him, a field was only land to be paved, a barn only lumber to be torn down. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was low, steady, almost detached. "It's not worthless to me." He laughed, a short, cutting sound, as if she had told a child's joke. "That's the problem, Claire. You keep thinking with your heart instead of your head. and your heart's going to bury us under debt if you don't wise up." The laugh lingered even after he left the table. Heading out the door toward the truck he always claimed was too good for farm roads. The screen door slammed, the sound sharp against the stillness. She sat alone at the table, staring at the rings etched into the oak, listening to the echo of his mockery settle in the walls. The farm stretched outside, acres of bare winter fields waiting for spring. He saw only taxes and weeds. She saw something else, something she couldn't yet name, but something that felt older and deeper than both of them. And for the first time in a long while, she wondered if the farm was listening too. The farmhouse sat with a weary slouch, as though the years had pressed down on its shoulders until even its timbers forgot how to stand tall. The paint, once white and proud, had long since peeled into gray flakes that clung stubbornly in patches, refusing surrender entirely but offering no illusion of youth. Windows sagged in their frames, glass rippled by time and weather, catching light in warped patterns that made the whole house seem to breathe. Every gust of wind whispered through gaps in the siding, stirring dust motes that had drifted for decades across the same rooms, settling on the same worn floorboards. Inside, the air smelled of old wood, kerosene, and the faint sweetness of apples long since gone. Her grandmother's rocker still leaned in the corner of the parlor, its cushions sunken and threadbare, the wood polished smooth by hands at one-stitch quilts and shell beans in the fading light of evening. The wallpaper had curled at the edges, the flowers bleached into ghosts of color. A cast-iron stove, blackened by decades of use, stood cold in the kitchen. It looked less like abandonment and more like a pause, objects waiting for hands that would never return. Beyond the house, the barns leaned into one another like old men at the edge of a field, weary but still standing out of habit. The main barn, built by her great-grandfather, sagged in the middle where storms had gnawed at its roof, leaving shingles scattered like fallen leaves across the pasture. Rust streaked the nails that once bit firm into beams hewn by hand. The red paint had surrendered to weather, peeling away to reveal what's silvered by sun and rain. Inside, swallows had claimed the rafters, their nests clinging to splintered beams, while hay that had once fed cattle now crumbled into dried dust beneath their wings. In the smaller shed, tools slept under layers of rust and cobwebs. A scythe leaned against the wall, its blade dulled and spotted, a ghost of harvest long forgotten. Wooden crates, once used for apples and potatoes, had warped with moisture, their slats bending inward. A harness, stiffened with time, still hung on a peg near the door. Each object seemed to wait for recognition, for someone to understand the years they had endured. To her husband, these were ruins. He walked past them with a sneer, calling them relics that should have been torn down years ago. "Nothing but firewood," he had said once, kicking at a loose plank until it splintered beneath his boot. To him, sagging roofs and broken boards were proof of failure, a reminder that the land no longer produced what it once had. He measured worth in profits and appraisals, not in the weight of memory, but she saw something different. When her hand brushed the barn door, she felt the grooves carved by her grandfather's knife, tally marks from a season's harvest. When she climbed the creaking stairs of the loft, she remembered summers when cousins tumbled in the hay, laughter echoing off the beams. Even the dust that clung to every surface seemed to her like a record of lives lived in steady rhythm with the land, planting, tending, harvesting, enduring. The field stretched beyond the buildings, furrows softened into gentle swells by years of disuse. Weeds claimed the edges, goldenrod and thistle marking the boundaries where rows once stood straight and ordered. The orchard sagged too, apple trees gnarled and twisted, branches heavy not with fruit but with lichen and moss. Yet even here, when spring came, blossoms still erupted, fragile pink and white against dark bark, stubborn in their beauty. She walked those fields slowly, her boots sinking into the earth her ancestors had turned with plows pulled by horses before engines replaced them. Each step reminded her that the land remembered, even if people forgot. She knew her husband could not see it. To him, all of this was dust, an inheritance that drained rather than enriched. He laughed when she spoke of preserving it, telling her there was no dignity in decay. Still, when she stood in the doorway of the house at dusk, the sky burning orange behind the barns, she felt the pull of something larger than money. The dust in the rafters, the peeling paint, the sagging beams, All of it carried a weight beyond his mocking words. They were relics, yes, but not useless. They were proof that her family had endured storms, droughts, hard winters, and lean harvests. Proof that they had built with their hands, lived with their backs bent but unbroken. He dismissed it as worthless. She could not. The dust was not just neglect. It was memory settling gently over everything, waiting for someone willing to brush it aside and look closer. The Whitaker name had been tied to the soil for longer than anyone in town could remember. In the courthouse ledgers, their handwriting still appeared in neat ink beside property lines, dates of sale, and tax records stretching back to the late 1800s. They were not wealthy men or celebrated women. They were farmers who measured time in planting seasons, in the rhythm of calves born and corn harvested, in winter survived and springs endured. Each generation added its quiet layer to the story of the land, and though none of them made headlines, their presence was pressed into every furrow of the fields and every scar on the barn beams. She thought of them often, especially when her husband's laughter filled the kitchen, mocking her devotion as foolishness. He liked to remind her that all those years of Whitaker sweat had left nothing but sagging timbers and dirt that couldn't pay the bills. He said their legacy was one of stubbornness, clinging to a losing hand while smarter families sold out and moved on. To him, they were proof that hard work meant nothing without profit. To her, they were proof that worth could not always be measured in money. Her great-grandfather, Elias Whitaker, had broken the first ground with a mule and a plow that is now nothing more than a rusted relic leaning against a fence line. He left behind no fortune, only the farm and a reputation for honesty so solid that neighbors still told stories of his handshake being as binding as any contract. His son, Charles, had nearly lost everything in the Dust Bowl years, but he stayed when others left, planting windbreaks and digging cisterns, try to hold the soil together with his bare hands. He left behind scars on his palms and a family that understood persistence in ways outsiders never could. Her grandmother, Ruth, carried the ledger that became more than a book of expenses and debts. It became a record of survival. How many jars of peaches were preserved one summer? How many hens made it through the winter? What price was fetched at market? Each page was a testimony, a quiet declaration that nothing was wasted, that even failure was recorded so it could be remembered. She had shown Claire those pages when she was a girl, running her fingers over the handwriting like scripture. "We don't forget," Ruth had said. "That's how we keep going." But her husband scoffed whenever she mentioned the ledger. A notebook full of failure, he called it, smirking as though the past would be erased with a cruel phrase. He didn't understand that it was not about failure or success, but about remembering. The Whitakers had been archivists of soil and memory, caretakers of more than just land. Each generation had believed that what was planted here mattered, even if the world outside saw nothing but dust and weeds. When she walked the fields alone, she could feel them, the weight of her grandfather's boots pressing the soil, the echo of her grandmother's voice calling children in from chores, the silent faith of all those who had stood against storms and lean years. They had not been mocked in their own time. They had been respected, even envied, for their endurance. Only now, in a world that valued subdivisions and shopping centers more than furrows and orchards, were they dismissed as fools. She knew her husband would never understand. To him, the Whitakers had been clinging to failure, holding on to land when they should have cashed out and moved to the city. He told her that often, leaning back in his chair with a tone of superiority, as though he were teaching her something. But to her, their choice to remain was not failure. It was devotion. It was a refusal to let go of something sacred just because it didn't shine with wealth. At night, when the wind crept through the cracks in the old house, she would sit with the ledger open on her lap. She would trace the lines of her grandmother's careful script and feel as though the voices of the past were speaking to her through ink and paper. They reminded her that she belonged to something older than ridicule, older than her husband's sharp laughter. She belonged to a line of people who believed the soil itself could remember. Her husband said they had left her nothing. She knew they had left her everything. The attic smelled of dust and cedar, the kind of dry air that clung to clothes and hair long after you left. Claire pulled the cord on a single bare bulb, and its yellow light spilled weakly across trunks, boxes, and forgotten shapes shrouded in sheets. She had been meaning to clean the space for years, but the roof always seemed to sag lower, and the insulation itched at her skin whenever she ventured up here. Still, she climbed the creaking steps that afternoon with a kind of determination that surprised even her. Her husband had spent the morning lecturing her about selling the farm, about how foolish it was to cling to rotting barns and empty fields, and she needed space to breathe. The attic was quiet, untouched, belonging only to memory. She pushed aside a box of moth-eaten quilts. Their once bright patterns now faded into dull shades of blue and red. An old steamer trunk crouched against the far wall, its leather cracked, its brass fittings green with corrosion. The lock was gone, broken years ago, and she lifted the lid expecting only the usual clutter: brittle newspapers, yellowed letters, a few china dishes wrapped in cloth. Instead, beneath a stack of wool coats that smelled of smoke and hay, she found a flat parcel wrapped in linen. She brushed the dust away and unwrapped it slowly, her hands trembling as though she might disturb something still alive. It was a ledger, bound in dark leather, its cover hand-stitched with careful, uneven thread. The edges were worn soft, and the pages smelled of earth, ink, and sweat. She recognized her grandfather's handwriting before she had even read a line. The letters curved with the steady hand of a man who believed in precision, who believed that recording the truth of each day mattered as much as living it. She sank onto the floorboards, cross-legged, the trunk yawning open beside her, and opened the book where the pages wanted to fall. The first entries were what she expected: lists of expenses, seed purchased, calves sold, notes about the weather that summer or the yield from a particular field. But as she turned further, the words began to change. Numbers appeared in neat rows that did not match bushels or prices. Symbols she did not recognize were tucked into the margins, repeating with curious regularity. A series of triangles drawn in faint pencil, small circles inked beside certain words. Sometimes an entire line of script gave way to marks that looked more like code than record. She traced them with her finger, feeling her pulse quicken. Her grandfather had been a practical man, not given to mystery or games. He wrote things down because he wanted them remembered, because he believed in order and clarity. Why, then, would he hide anything in cipher? She flipped to the back, where the handwriting grew tighter, the pages filled with almost nothing but symbols and numbers. It looked deliberate, not the scrawl of a man losing his mind, but the precise record of something he did not want easily read. A memory surfaced, faint as smoke, her grandmother once telling her that her grandfather had ways of keeping family matters private. Claire had thought she meant debts or deals made with neighbors during hard times, but now she wasn't so sure. She turned the book sideways, upside down, squinting at the marks as if they might rearrange themselves into meaning. They refused to. She set the ledger in her lap and looked around the attic. The objects that surrounded her, the coats, the trunks, the quilts, were the usual weight of inheritance. Heavy but familiar. This book was different. It hummed in her hands, as though it carried something more than memory, something her husband would laugh at if she dared to mention it. He would call it nonsense, a farmer's scribbles, another piece of worthless paper like everything else in this house. But she felt the opposite. She felt as though she had stumbled onto a secret meant for her and her alone. The pages seemed to breathe with possibility. She closed the book carefully, pressing her palm against the leather cover, and sat in the dim light of the attic while the dust swirled. Outside, she could hear the faint cry of crows in the fields and the wind brushing against the roof. Her grandfather's voice seemed to echo through time, not in words but in the careful marks he had left behind. She carried the ledger downstairs when the light began to fade, clutching it close to her chest like it might be stolen as she loosened her grip. Her husband was not home, and she was grateful for the silence. She set the book on the kitchen table, the same table where he had mocked her hours earlier, and stared at it. The pages had been waiting for decades, patient, preserved. Whatever they meant, they were hers now. She was determined to learn what her grandfather had hidden, even if no one else believed it was worth the effort. The kitchen table became the battlefield, though neither of them ever named it that. The papers lay spread across the oak surface, pamphlets from developers, glossy images of neat rows of houses, promises of quick money in bold type. He jabbed a finger at one of the brochures, his jaw tight, his voice carrying that sharp tone he used whenever he thought logic was on his side. Look at these numbers, Claire. They're offering more than this place has ever made in a single year. We could pay off debts, buy a house in town, start fresh without this dead weight dragging us down. His words came fast, clipped like he had rehearsed them. He leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who believed the argument was already won. She stayed quiet for a long moment, eyes fixed not on the papers but on the window beyond, where the last of the evening sun stretched across the fields. The land rolled out in shades of gold and green, furrows softened by time, the barns in silhouette. She folded her hands in her lap, steadying herself, then finally answered, "This isn't dead weight. This is home. This is family. You can't put a price tag on that." He laughed, not cruelly at first, but dismissively, the sound that always made her skin prickle. Home? Family? That's just dirt and wood out there. Sagging barns, weeds taller than fence posts, soil that hasn't produced a decent yield in years. Your family held on to this land like it was gold, and where did it get them? Here you are, sitting on a pile of rot, while developers are willing to hand us a fortune to take it off our hands. You want to talk about family? Think about the one you've got now. Think about me. Think about our future, instead of clinging to ghosts. Her voice rose before she could stop it. Don't call them ghosts. They worked themselves into the ground for this land, and they did it so I could stand here today. My grandfather bled into these fields. My grandmother kept records of every jar, every acre, every season because it mattered. It mattered to them, and it matters to me. She pushed the brochures back toward him, the slick paper sliding across the table with sharp sound. You think money erases history? You think selling this land makes us richer? It only makes us poorer in ways you don't understand. His face hardened, the easy smirk gone, replaced by something colder. He leaned forward, palms flat on the table, eyes locked on hers. What I understand is survival. What I understand is not drowning under tax bills and repair costs. I understand opportunity, when it stared me in the face, and only a fool would turn it down. You can keep romanticizing this place all you want, but at the end of the day, all it gives us is debt. She swallowed, her throat dry, but refused to look away. You see debt, I see promise. You see weeds, I see roots. You see failure, I see what they left for me. You don't understand because you never wanted to, but I won't let you sell it. Not while I still have a say. The silence that followed was sharp, as if the house itself was listening. The tick of the clock on the wall felt louder than usual, each second dragging the argument deeper into the air between them. He straightened, collected the papers with deliberate movements, and shoved them back into his folder. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice low, almost quiet, but carrying more weight than if he'd shouted. "When the bills pile higher, when the roof finally caves in, when there's nothing left but rubble, don't expect him to stand here and say, 'I didn't warn you.'" He pushed back from the table and walked out, his boots striking hard against the worn floorboards, the door slamming behind him. She sat alone in the fading light, the ledger resting nearby on the counter where she had left it earlier. Her hand shook as she reached for it, pulling it into her lap like a shield. The leather felt warm under her fingers, the stitching rough but steady. She opened it to the coded pages, tracing the strange symbols her grandfather had left behind. Her husband saw only empty land, but she was beginning to believe there was something more, something the Whitakers had guarded, something buried in these fields that money alone could not explain. She turned another page, her breath steadying. The argument echoed still, but beneath it was a different sound, quieter, older, the voice of the land itself, urging her not to give up. The morning had started like so many others, the low hum of the tractor rolling over the uneven earth, the smell of diesel rising in the crisp air. Claire gripped the wheel with steady hands, guiding the old machine down the shallow line she'd been carving across the east field. The soil here was stubborn, hard from years of neglect, but she felt a kind of quiet resolve each time the plow cut into it. Her husband had scoffed at her efforts when she told him she planned to turn the field again, calling it wasted fuel, wasted time. Yet she persisted. The land had waited long enough. The tractor growled as it moved forward, the blade biting into the earth, rolling dark clumps to the surface. She leaned into the rhythm of it, back and forth, the engine's noise merging with the steady call of crows in the distance. Sweat traced a line down her temple despite the coolness of the day, but she pressed on, determined to finish the roll before noon. Then came the jolt. The blade struck something with a metallic screech, the entire machine shuddering beneath her. She clutched the wheel, slammed her foot on the brake, and felt the tractor lurch to a halt. For a moment, silence settled heavy around her, broken only by the hiss of the engine. She climbed down slowly, her boots sinking into the newly turned soil, and walked toward the plow. The blade had bitten deep into the earth and caught against something buried just below the surface. At first, she thought it was just another stone, one of the many that had always haunted these fields, turn up year after year no matter how often they were cleared. But as she crouched down and brushed the dirt away with her hand, she froze. The surface was too smooth, too deliberate. Her fingers traced across what looked like carved lines, straight, measured grooves that intersected in neat angles. This was no ordinary rock. She cleared more soil, her breath catching as the marks became clearer. There were shapes, symbols almost etched into the stone's face. The grooves were shallow but precise, cut in a way that spoke of intention rather than accident. She ran her hand along the edges, feeling the crispness of the cuts even after all these years underground. Her heart quickened. She sat back on her heels, staring at the exposed surface, her mind reaching for explanations. Her husband would laugh, she knew. He would call it farmer's folly, a trick of nature, nothing more than scratches from plow. But she had seen enough of natural stone to know the difference. This was not the work of weather or chance. She stood and scanned the field, the furrows stretching out in both directions, the horizon flat and unbroken. The farm had always seemed quiet, ordinary, yet here was something that didn't belong, something waiting beneath the soil. She wiped her dirt-stained hands on her jeans and crouched again, this time pulling a small trowel from the tractor's toolbox. Bit by bit, she worked around the stone, uncovering more of its surface, each inch revealing the same deliberate carvings. By midday, she had exposed a slab nearly 2 feet wide, the markings covering it in patterns that repeated with strange consistency. Some resembled triangles, others parallel lines, and in the corner, a shape that looked almost like a circle broken by a cross. She touched it lightly, the weight of the discovery pressing against her chest. The sun was high now, beating down on her back, and still she knelt in the dirt, unable to walk away. The ledger came to her mind, the coded entries her grandfather had left behind. Could this be connected? Had he known about the stone, perhaps even marked its location in those cryptic notes? She remembered the triangles and circles scribbled in the margins of the book, how they had puzzled her. Now she wondered if they were not mere symbols, but directions, maps pointing to what lay hidden beneath the fields. The rumble of a truck pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up to see her husband leaning out the window, a smirk already forming as he called across the field. "Break something, Claire? Told you that old tractor wasn't worth the fuel." She didn't answer. Instead, she stood protectively in front of the stone, her body blocking it from view. He drove on, uninterested, his laughter fading with the sound of the engine. She exhaled slowly, relief washing over her. Whatever this was, she wasn't ready to share it. Not with him, not yet. As the afternoon waned, she covered the stone again, pulling soil back over its surface until only a faint outline remained. The secret would keep, at least for now. She climbed back onto the tractor and finished her rows, but the rhythm was gone. Every pass, every turn of the blade, her eyes drifted back to the place where the stone slept beneath the soil. The farm had always been mocked as worthless, a burden to sell, a relic of failure. But now the land itself had spoken, breaking the surface to reveal something that refused to be dismissed. For the first time, Claire felt certain her family had left her more than memory. The earth was keeping its own record, written in stone, waiting for her to uncover the rest. The diner smelled of bacon grease and strong coffee, the kind of scent that never really left the air no matter how many windows were open or how much the fans hummed. Claire sat in her usual corner booth, the ledger tucked carefully inside her bag, its weight heavier than any book should be. She had meant to bring it with her, but she couldn't leave it sitting on the kitchen counter where her husband might glance at it and toss it aside as nonsense. "Here, With the morning bustle of farmers and truckers around her, she felt safer. The book stayed close, pressed against her leg like a secret. The bell above the door chimed, and in walked Thomas Avery, the town's unofficial historian. He was a thin man in his 60s with spectacles that always seemed a size too large for his face and hands that shook slightly when he carried his coffee cup. People often tease him for knowing more about the dead than the living, but when anyone had a question about land records or family trees, it was Thomas they came to. He made his way to the counter, exchanging greetings, his voice soft and deliberate as always. Claire hesitated, then called out to him, "Mr. Avery?" He turned, his brows lifting in polite surprise. "Mrs. Whitaker. Or rather, Mrs. Carson now, isn't it?" His eyes softened, catching the flicker of unease that crossed her face. He shuffled toward her booth. "I don't believe we've spoken much since your grandmother's funeral. How are you holding up with the old place?" She managed a small smile. "It's still standing, though my husband thinks that's more a curse than a blessing." Thomas chuckled lightly, then slid into the booth across from her. "Well, some men can only see the present. Farms are more than dirt, though. They're layers of stories. Your family has plenty." The words nudged her courage forward. Slowly, she pulled the ledger from her bag and placed it on the table between them. His eyes widened behind his thick glasses, and his hands reached out as though he were touching something sacred. "Good Lord, is that Elias Whitaker's ledger? I've heard of it, but I didn't know it survived." She nodded, pushing it toward him. "I found it in the attic. There are pages I don't understand. Symbols, numbers, things that don't look like farming records." He opened it carefully, as if the leather might crumble under his touch. Page after page turned until he reached the coded sections. His finger traced the triangles, circles, and cross lines. He leaned closer, his lips moving without sound, eyes narrowing with recognition. "Well, I'll be," he whispered after a long pause. "What is it?" Claire asked, her voice hushed, though no one nearby was paying attention. He looked up at her, his face alight with something between wonder and concern. "These aren't random marks. They're survey symbols. Early ones, from when this county was first mapped in the early 19th century. See here? This triangle with the dot, it marked wells. Parallel lines like these indicated property boundaries. And this 1 inch, he tapped the circle with a cross, was often used to show a vault or deposit site, usually something valuable enough to be recorded but not described outright." Her pulse quickened. "My grandfather was a surveyor. Why would he know these?" Thomas closed the book gently and leaned back. Families who held land for generations often kept more detailed records than the county ever did. They didn't trust officials to preserve what mattered. Sometimes they passed on knowledge in ways outsiders couldn't interpret. It looks to me like Elias wasn't just keeping track of crops and debts. He was preserving a map. Claire stared at the closed ledger, the weight of his words pressing into her chest. A map, not of roads or rivers, but the land she had nearly allowed herself to believe was empty. "So, you think there's something out there? Something buried?" Thomas hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I think your grandfather knew the land held more than soil and memory, whether a vault, a marker, or just his way of protecting family secrets. I can't say, but I wouldn't dismiss it. The Whitakers were meticulous. If he wrote it, it mattered." She sat back, her coffee gone cold beside her, and let the thought sink in. Across from her, Thomas placed a hand on the ledger as though sealing a pact. "If you'd like," he said quietly, "I can compare these with the old deeds at the courthouse. There may be something the county maps don't show anymore. Record vanish, but symbols like these, well, they endure." Claire nodded, her voice low but steady. "I'd like that. I need to know what he was trying to leave behind." The diner hummed on around them, plates clattering, conversations rising and falling. But at that booth in the corner, the world seemed to narrow to the old book resting between them. For the first time, she felt that her grandfather's cryptic pages weren't just a riddle. They were a key, and now, someone else had confirmed that she wasn't imagining things. The courthouse smelled of old paper and floor wax, The kind of scent that seemed to cling to the stone walls no matter how many times they polished the tiles or cracked the tall windows open. Claire followed Thomas Avery up the marble steps, the ledger clutched under her arm, her heart thrumming in her chest with an anxious rhythm. She had not told her husband where she was going, only that she had errands in town. If he knew she was spending her afternoon with maps and deeds instead of preparing the farm for sale, his laughter would echo for days. Thomas led her into a back room where shelves bowed under the weight of leather-bound record books. The clerk barely looked up as he waved them past, used to the historian's visits. Dust hung in the air, visible in shafts of weak sunlight that filtered through the blinds. Thomas moved with quiet energy, pulling heavy volumes from the shelves, stacking them on a wide oak table. He opened them with the reverence of a priest, turning brittle pages slowly until lines of ink stretched before them. Grids, parcels, boundaries carefully drawn by hands long gone. "These are the earliest surveys of this county," he murmured, sliding one book toward her. "Official plats from the 1820s. Every road, every stream, every boundary line recorded as best they could manage then." Claire leaned over, her eyes following the straight black lines that divided the county into squares. Each parcel bore a number, a name, or sometimes only a blank where ownership was uncertain. The pages looked orderly, final, like the sort of document her husband would believe in without question. But Thomas reached for another book, older still, the binding cracked, the ink faded to sepia. "And these," he said softly, "are the private surveys kept by families, land agents, even churches. They don't always agree with the county records." He set the second map beside the first, aligning the edges. At first glance, the two looked identical, but as Claire leaned closer, her brow furrowed. Small differences appeared the longer she studied them. A creek in the official map stretched straight across one corner of the Whitaker land, but in the older record, it bent sharply and ended at a symbol that looked like a cross. A square of land on the county plat appeared empty, yet in the family map, it bore initials and measurements, as though it had once belonged to someone the official records had forgotten. Her finger trembled slightly as she traced one boundary. "This line, it doesn't match at all." Thomas nodded, adjusting his glasses. "Exactly. Look here. According to the county, your family's eastern field was surveyed as a single parcel, but in this older document, it's divided. And see these marks." He tapped lightly where tiny triangles and circles dotted the edge of the field. "They correspond to the symbols in your grandfather's ledger." She opened the ledger, flipping quickly to the coded pages, her heart pounding as she set it beside the maps. The shapes matched, triangles marking wells, circles broken by crosses in places where the official map showed nothing. Side by side, the connections were undeniable. "It's like," Claire whispered, "someone erased parts of the land's history, smoothed it over." Thomas leaned back, his eyes thoughtful. "It's not uncommon. During times of upheaval, wars, depressions, even prohibition, records vanished or were altered. Families sometimes held knowledge the county never acknowledged, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. But when maps don't match, it usually means someone wanted something hidden." She sat in silence for a moment, the words sinking deep. The field she had walked since childhood, the same fields her husband mocked as useless, were drawn differently depending on which book you opened. On paper, her family's land carried mysteries, omissions, secrets deliberately left outside the official story. "What do you think it means?" she asked finally. Thomas closed the old survey book with a careful hand. "It means your grandfather left you more than memories. He left you a puzzle. And puzzles like this don't get written down unless the answer is worth guarding." The hum of the courthouse lights filled the silence that followed. Claire felt her throat tighten as she looked at the mismatched maps, at the ledger lying between them like a bridge across time. Her husband's voice echoed faintly in her memory, mocking her devotion, calling the land worthless. But here, surrounded by the weight of paper and ink, she felt something shift. The land was speaking in symbols, boundaries, and erasures, and she was finally beginning to understand its language. When she left the courthouse, the afternoon sun was sharp against the stone steps. The ledger pressed tightly to her chest. The field she returned to no longer felt ordinary. They held pieces of history that had been buried, forgotten, or deliberately concealed. And somewhere beneath her boots, in soil her family had plowed for generations, the truth waited to be uncovered. The orchard had once been the pride of the farm. Rows of apple trees stretched across the rise behind the house, their blossoms painting the air white and pink each spring, their fruit-filling baskets in the fall. But that was decades ago. By the time Claire inherited the land, the trees had grown gnarled and weary, branches heavy with lichen instead of fruit, their bark split and peeling. Only a few scattered blossoms ever appeared now, and those withered before the season turned. She walked the rows often, more out of habit than hope, her boots crunching across brittle leaves that no longer promised harvest. One afternoon, she paused before a tree that leaned more heavily than the rest. Its trunk twisted as though the earth beneath it had shifted. She remembered her grandmother once saying that this particular tree had been stubborn, bearing well even in lean years. But for as long as Claire could recall, it had been barren, standing like a monument to decline. She placed her hand against the trunk, feeling the rough bark beneath her palm, and wondered why this tree had survived storms and seasons only to stop giving. A faint hollow sound caught her attention as she shifted her weight, her boot heel striking the ground near the roots. She froze, then tapped the soil again. The sound echoed differently, less like packed earth, more like a drum struck softly. Kneeling, she brushed aside leaves and debris, then dug with her hands until her fingers struck stone. The surface was flat, cold, and smoother than any rock naturally buried there. Her heart quickened. She rose and returned with a small spade, working carefully at the soil until more of the stone was visible. Soon she uncovered a circular rim, its edge defined by carefully fitted masonry. It was too precise, too deliberate to be chance. As the dirt fell away, the outline of a cistern emerged, sealed shut with heavy stones cemented together long ago. She sat back on her heels, brushing hair from her face, and stared at it. A cistern hidden beneath a tree that had stopped bearing fruit. Something about it felt deliberate, almost symbolic. She leaned forward again, running her hand along the rim, her fingers catching the grooves of old mortar. Whoever sealed it had not intended it to be opened easily. Her mind drifted to the ledger, to the symbols her grandfather had drawn. Circles with crosses, triangles, notations that had puzzled her until Thomas Avery suggested they were survey marks. Had the system been one of them? Was this what the old maps had hinted at? Boundaries and parcels that didn't match, odd marks recorded only in private? She imagined her grandfather walking this orchard, perhaps planting the tree to disguise the work done beneath it. Maybe it watched the tree thrive for a time, its fruit cover for what lay below, until the roots tangled with the sealed stone and the harvest ceased. The thought sent a shiver through her, as though the land itself had conspired to keep a secret. The sound of gravel crunching pulled her from her thoughts. Her husband's truck passed along the lane, the engine loud and dismissive. She instinctively brushed soil over the rim, hiding the edges of stone from sight until it looked once more like ordinary ground. He would see nothing but wasted effort, another sign of her foolish attachment to the farm. He would mock the discovery before she even explained it. When the truck noise faded, she knelt again, touching the sealed cistern with renewed certainty. This was not just a forgotten water source. It was too carefully hidden, too deliberately placed. The orchard might have grown silent, the branches barren, but beneath her hand was proof that the land was holding something back. She rose slowly, brushing dirt from her jeans, and looked across the orchard. The other trees stood crooked and tired, their branches rattling faintly in the breeze. But this one, rooted above the sealed stone, felt different, as if it were guarding something. The thought both unsettled and steadied her. For the first time in years, the orchard was no longer just a graveyard of fruitless trees. It was a map in itself, waiting for her to follow its signs. She made her way back to the house as dusk crept in, the ledger already on her mind. She would compare the marks again, study them with new eyes. The cistern was not an accident. It was part of the story her grandfather had left behind, buried just deep enough to wait for her hands to uncover it. The orchard, long dismissed as useless, had spoken, and she intended to listen. The Bible had always been there, resting on the shelf in the parlor, its black leather cover dulled to a soft gray with age. Claire had dusted around it for years, careful not to disturb the fragile pages that seemed ready to crumble if touched too often. It had belonged to her grandmother, Ruth, and before that, to Ruth's mother. Family births, deaths, and marriages were written in neat script on the first pages, the ink fading but still legible, each line a record of lives tethered to this farm. One evening, when the arguments with her husband still rang in her ears and the weight of the orchard discovery pressed on her chest, she pulled the Bible down and carried it to the kitchen table. The house was quiet, and for once she was glad of the silence. The leather was cool beneath her palms as she opened it, careful not to strain the spine. She flipped past the genealogy pages, her eyes catching names she knew only through stories. Elias, Charles, Martha, voices from long ago, silent but not forgotten. Beyond the names lay thin pages filled with scripture, the words dense and familiar. Yet it wasn't the printed text she searched for, but the margins. Her grandmother had always believed in writing reminders there, little notes about planting, weather, or even neighbors who needed prayer. The Bible had served as much a ledger as a spiritual guide, and Claire knew that if Ruth had something important to remember, it would be tucked between the verses. She turned carefully, scanning the edges. Some notes were simple: corn blighted 1947, or heavy frost by May. Others were prayers: guide Charles home safe from war. But as she reached the middle, her breath caught. In the margin beside a psalm, written in her grandmother's looping hand, were the words, asterisk, the stones beneath the east field. Asterisk, her heart skipped. She traced the faint ink, her mind racing. It was too specific, too deliberate to be idle musing. She whispered the words aloud, tasting their weight in the air. The stones beneath the east field. The phrase connected instantly with the ledger, with the maps, with the sealed cistern she had uncovered. Her grandmother, so devout and steady, had chosen this place to record the clue, inside the family Bible, where it would be safe, where it would blend into prayers and scripture. She leaned back, staring at the words, the kitchen lamp casting a soft circle of light around her. She could almost see Ruth at this very table, pen in hand, deciding to leave a mark where only someone who cared deeply about both faith and family would ever notice. A shiver ran down her arms. The east field stretched beyond the orchard, land her husband mocked as useless because it grew more weeds and crops. But now, with the ledger symbols, the mismatched maps, and these words from her grandmother, it no longer looked empty. It looked purposeful, guarded. The stones beneath it were not just natural formations. They were something placed, something worth remembering, something worth hiding. She read the phrase again, and her eyes caught on another faint note a few pages later. Keep safe what was entrusted. The handwriting was shakier, likely added in Ruth's later years, but the meaning struck her like a whisper carried down from the past. Entrusted, safe, stones, Eastfield. Her husband's voice echoed in memory, mocking her faith in the land, calling it worthless. Yet here was her grandmother, speaking across time with quiet insistence that the soil carried more than crops. Claire closed the Bible gently, pressing her hand against the cover as though sealing the words inside her. She felt no need to share this discovery with him. He would laugh, dismiss it as a woman's scribble, another excuse for her not to sell. But she knew better. Her grandmother had written carefully, purposefully, with a certainty that someone, perhaps only Claire, would one day look closely enough to see. The Bible, the ledger, the maps, the orchard, they were pieces of the same puzzle. Her family had left her a trail, scattered across objects worn by time but not erased. The house creaked softly as wind pressed against its old frame, and Claire sat alone at the table, the Bible beside her, the weight of generations pressing on her shoulders. Outside, the east field stretched in darkness, silent and ordinary to anyone passing by. But in her mind, it was alive with secrets, with whispers of stones and hidden things waiting for the right hands to uncover them. For the first time, she felt certain her grandmother had meant for her to find this clue, that the farm was speaking not just through memory but through deliberate marks left behind. She blew out the lamp, leaving the kitchen in shadow, the Bible resting where her grandmother might have placed it years ago. In the silence, the words still lingered, steady and insistent. The stones beneath the east field. The tension had been building for days, each silence heavier than the one before, each shared meal eaten with the scrape of forks and little else. Claire had felt it coming, the way a storm builds unseen over the horizon, the air thickening long before the first strike of lightning. When her husband finally spoke, it came not as a suggestion, but as a decree, his voice sharp against the hum of the refrigerator. "I've had enough of this," he said, tossing a folded brochure onto the kitchen table. The glossy paper slid across the wood and stopped against her hand. "I called 2 investors this morning. They're interested. They're ready to buy. All we have to do is sign." She looked down at the brochure without opening it. The cover showed a row of neat houses, sidewalks edged with trimmed grass, children riding bikes in a neighborhood that looked nothing like the rolling fields outside their window. She traced the edge of the paper, her stomach sinking. "You did this without asking me?" she asked quietly, though she already knew the answer. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with that familiar smirk. "I shouldn't have to ask. This farm is bleeding us dry, Claire. Every month it's the same bills, the same repairs, the same empty promises. And now, instead of facing reality, you're up in attics and orchards chasing some fantasy your grandfather scribbled in a book. A treasure hunt, really? Do you know how ridiculous you sound?" Her hands tightened on the paper until it crumpled. She fought to keep her voice steady. "This isn't a fantasy. The ledger, the maps, even the Bible, they're all connected. There's something here. My family left it for a reason." He laughed, a hard sound that cut through her words. "Your family left you debt and dust. That's all. You think a few doodles in a notebook mean buried riches? You think the county's been sitting on millions under our feet and no one noticed? You're delusional, Claire, and I'm done humoring you." She met his eyes then, her voice rising for the first time. "You don't see because you don't want to. You never cared about this land. To you, it's numbers on a page. But to me, it's more. It's history, it's blood, it's memory. And I won't sell it just because you want easy money." His face darkened, the smirk slipping into a scowl. "Easy money? You think working with investors is easy? It's survival. Something you'd understand if you stopped living in fairy tales. They'll pave this land, build something useful, and we'll finally move on instead of drowning in the past." The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Outside, the wind rattled the loose pane in the window, the farm itself groaning as if listening. She saw the lines in his face, etched deeper with frustration, and realized there was no reaching him. His mind was fixed on profit, on escape, on selling what she had sworn to protect. He stood abruptly, gathering his keys. "They're coming on Saturday to look at the place. You can be here or not, but I'm showing them the property. One way or another, Claire, this farm is getting sold." The door slammed behind him, the echo carrying through the old house like a final verdict. She sat alone at the table, the brochure still crushed in her hand, her chest tight with anger and fear. She thought of her grandmother's Bible, of the words about the stones beneath the east field, of her grandfather's coded ledger. There were whispers, fragments, clues that pointed to something she couldn't yet name, but something real. Her husband's ultimatum rang in her ears, but beneath it she heard another voice, the steady insistence of the land itself, the voices of her family who had endured storms, droughts, and years of ridicule. She knew what she had to do. The investors would come, but before they set foot on the soil, she would uncover what lay hidden. If the farm held its secret, it had chosen her to find it, not him, not anyone else. The clock was ticking, but she felt no defeat, only resolve. The next afternoon, Claire found herself walking the narrow lane that bordered the farm, the sun low and golden against the fields. She carried the weight of her husband's ultimatum like a stone in her chest, her mind circling the same thought. Saturday, 2 days until strangers came to measure, to judge, to put a price on what she could not let go. She needed clarity, some thread to follow that would make sense of the ledger, the maps, the whispers from her grandmother's Bible. It was then that she saw Mr. Grady, her nearest neighbor, leaning against his fence. He was in his 80s, his frame wiry but unbent, his cap pulled low against the light. He had lived on the adjoining property since before Claire was born, and he carried with him the memory of things others had long forgotten. She had known him as a quiet presence, the kind who waved from a distance but rarely lingered in conversation. Today, though, he was waiting. He raised a hand as she approached, his lined face softening into something close to a smile. "You've been busy out there," he said, his voice gravelly from age and years of smoke. "Saw the tractor kicking up dust yesterday. Haven't seen those rows turned in a long time." Claire nodded, brushing her hair for her eyes, trying to make sense of things. Found something unusual. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "A stone buried shallow, carved. Doesn't look natural." Mr. Grady chuckled, though the sound carried no real amusement. "Ah, you're chasing ghosts then." Folks used to talk about things like that. Stones, caches, secrets buried when no one was looking. Mostly foolish talk to pass the time. She frowned, curiosity pressing past her caution. "What kind of caches?" He leaned heavier on the fence rail, his eyes narrowing as if peering back into memory. "Prohibition days. My father used to tell me there were men in these parts who didn't just farm corn. They brewed with it. Whiskey, gin, whatever fetched the price. Law was tight, but the land's wide enough to hide just about anything. They say some families dug pits, sealed cisterns, tucked away crates when the sheriffs came sniffing around. Couldn't always dig them back up. Some of it, they say, is still out there." Claire's pulse quickened. She thought instantly of the sealed cistern beneath the apple tree, of the ledger's strange symbols, of her grandmother's marginal notes. "Did anyone ever find anything?" she asked. Grady shook his head slowly, the brim of his cap shadowing his eyes. "Not that I heard. Just stories. Men sitting at the diner, swearing their granddaddy knew where a crate of bottles was buried, or that gold changed hands in secret. Never amounted to more than rumors. Most of us figure it was wishful thinking, a way to dress up hard years with a little mystery." He straightened, his expression shifting to something sterner. "Don't let it catch you, Claire. Chasing what ain't there can swallow a person whole. I've seen families break themselves trying to find fortune in the dirt. Better to tend what you can see than lose yourself to what might be." His warning carried weight, but she couldn't ignore the pieces falling into place in her own mind. He dismissed it as foolish, yet his words confirmed that the whispers she had uncovered weren't isolated. Others had heard them too, passed down through time until they blurred into half-forgotten tales. She thanked him softly, but as she walked back toward her farmhouse, his voice echoed behind her. She could picture him shaking his head, convinced she was another Whitaker clinging to the past, another dreamer searching for what had never been real. But she knew better. She had seen the stone carved with deliberate marks. She had touched the sealed rim of the cistern in the orchard. She had read her grandmother's handwriting in the Bible, steady even in age. The clues were too consistent to dismiss. The neighbor's warning might have been given in kindness, but she felt it only deepened her resolve. The farm was not simply soil and weeds. It was a vault of memory, and perhaps more. By the time she reached the house, the light had faded into dusk. The old barns stood like watchmen against the sky, their shadows stretching long across the fields. She carried Mr. Grady's word with her, but they did not weaken her conviction. If anything, they sharpened it. What others dismissed as foolish tales might be the very truth she was meant to uncover. And she would, no matter how close Saturday drew. The ground around the old apple tree had always been stubborn, its soil dense with roots that clawed deep into the earth. Claire returned to it at first light, the air still cool enough to sting her lungs. She carried only a spade and the determination that had been building since her neighbor's warning. The sealed cistern had haunted her thoughts through the night. She had dreamt of her grandmother's handwriting, of the ledger's symbols, of stones resting beneath the east field. Now she was certain this tree, this ground, was part of what her family had hidden. She began by scraping away the layer of leaves and loose soil she had hastily thrown back over the rim days before. The shape of the stone circle emerged again, damp earth clinging to its edges. She dropped to her knees, her spade biting into the soil just beyond the rim. Inch by inch, she worked to expose more of the buried structure. Sweat gathered at her brow despite the morning chill, trickling down her temple as she pried at roots that had long since entwined themselves around the stones. As the sun climbed, she uncovered more than she expected. The rim was not just a ring of loose stones, but part of a larger construction. Beneath the roots, she revealed blocks of limestone, pale and smooth, fitted together with an exactness that startled her. She brushed away dirt with her hands, fingertips tracing the sharp edges. These stones were cut and placed with purpose, too precise to have been assembled by chance or for ordinary farm work. Claire sat back on her heels, staring at the clean lines now visible through the soil. Her grandfather had been a meticulous man, but he had never had the means to cut stone like this, not with farm tools and long days spent tending crops. This had been built by someone with skill, someone who had intended it to last. The orchard around her seemed to grow quiet, the calls of birds fading as though the land itself were holding its breath. She glanced toward the house, half expecting to see her husband's truck pulling into the lane. If he caught her digging here, he would sneer at her discovery, dismiss the blocks as old foundation stones or worse, accuse her of desperation. But she knew better. Every instinct told her this was the beginning of something larger. She dug deeper, careful now, prying soil from between the cracks. The mortar that held the stones together had hardened into a chalky substance that crumbled only under steady pressure. With each clump of dirt she cleared, more of the block's surface was revealed. They formed a wall, straight and solid, angling downward as though leading to something below. By midday, she had cleared enough to see that the stones extended far beyond the circumference of the tree. This was not merely a cistern for water, not the simple pit she had first imagined. It was a structure, deliberate and hidden, sealed and disguised beneath a tree that had lived and died without ever giving its secret away. She leaned against the trunk, her chest heaving, her palms raw from work. The sun bore down now, casting sharp shadows across the orchard. She closed her eyes, recalling the strange symbols in her grandfather's ledger, the triangles, the circles broken by crosses. Could this wall of stone be what he had marked, what her grandmother had alluded to in her Bible? The thought sent a shiver through her despite the heat. The Whitakers had endured hard years, yes, but perhaps they had endured because they had been guarding something. Not money earned from crops, not luck, but something hidden in the soil, something worth concealing for generations. Claire rose again, unwilling to stop. She pressed her hands against the smooth limestone, feeling its coolness even under blazing sun. This was no accident. She knew now that her family had left her more than memory. The first breakthrough was here at her feet, and it was only the beginning. She gathered the loose soil back over the stones before leaving, her arms trembling with exhaustion. The orchard looked unchanged, the trees still twisted and barren, the ground ordinary. Yet beneath the surface, the truth waited. She walked back to the house slowly, dirt clinging to her clothes, her resolve hardening with every step. Her husband could call investors, mock her treasure hunt, dismiss her as clinging to ghosts. But she had touched the stones herself, carved and set with a precision no farmer's hand could explain. For the first time, she felt the certainty of discovery, the thrill of knowing the land had spoken back. The farm was not failing her. It was yielding its secret, one stone at a time. The sound of tires crunching along the gravel lane reached Claire before she saw the car. She was in the orchard again, crouched beside the tree where she had unearthed the first line of limestone blocks. The morning light slanted through the branches, scattering shadows across the ground as she brushed soil from the stones. Each pass of her hand felt like a conversation with the past, the surface cool beneath her fingers, steady against the shifting soil. She didn't hear her husband approach until his voice broke the stillness. "There she is," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. When she turned, his arms were folded, and the look on his face was a mix of disdain and triumph. "I told you, Claire, you dig around out here long enough, and somebody's going to notice. Lucky for you, I went ahead and made the call myself." Before she could respond, the sheriff's cruiser pulled into the yard, dust rising behind its tires. Sheriff McAllister stepped out slowly, adjusting his belt as he surveyed the scene. He was a man of few words, broad-shouldered and graying at the temples, his badge catching the sunlight as he approached. His gaze moved from Claire's mud-stained jeans to the shallow excavation at her feet, then to her husband, who had straightened with a smug expression. "She's at it again," her husband said quickly, gesturing toward the ground. digging up the place like she's gonna strike gold. I figured you ought to come out before she goes tearing half the property apart. This isn't safe, and it sure as hell is insane. The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice was calm. Why don't you tell me what you're doing, Mrs. Carson? Claire wiped her hands on her jeans, her heart pounding harder than it should have. She wanted to explain everything. The ledger, the Bible, the mismatched maps, the cistern. But the words caught in her throat. She knew how it would sound spoken aloud. A farmer's wife digging holes because she believed her dead relatives had left behind a treasure. She met the sheriff's steady gaze and said only, I'm following what my family left me. Notes, records, they point here. Her husband barked a laugh. Notes? Records? She's got herself convinced the Whitakers were hiding fortunes out here. You and I both know that family barely kept food on the table. Now she's tearing up the orchard, embarrassing us both. You tell her, Sheriff, this is trespassing on fantasy, nothing more. The sheriff glanced at the hole again, crouching to run his hand along the exposed stone. He scraped away a bit of dirt with the toe of his boot, frowning as the smooth edge revealed itself beneath the soil. That's no fieldstone, he said quietly. Cut too clean. Her husband shifted uncomfortably. So it's an old cistern. Big deal. Doesn't change the fact that she's losing herself in this nonsense. I need her to stop before she makes us the laughingstock of the county. McAllister straightened, dusting his hands on his trousers. His expression was unreadable. She's on her own land. As far as I can see, she's got every right to dig a hole if she wants to. Doesn't break any laws. Claire felt a flicker of relief, though the sheriff's tone carried a weight that told her he wasn't dismissing what he'd seen either. He turned to her, his voice softer now. Just be careful. Things buried a long time have a way of surprising people. Her husband bristled. You're not helping, Sheriff. McAllister met his eyes evenly. I'm not here to take sides. I'm here to make sure nothing criminal's happening. And all I see is a woman working on her own soil. That's not against the law. The sheriff tipped his hat before walking back to his cruiser, leaving Claire standing by the tree, her hands still streaked with dirt. Her husband's face had gone red, his anger boiling under the surface. He spat into the grass and glared at her. Enjoy your hole, Claire. When those investors come, they'll see just how far gone you are. Don't think this little performance changes anything. The cruiser rolled away, the dust settling slowly in its wake. Claire crouched again, her palm pressed against the limestone blocks as if to draw strength from their cool solidity. Her husband could mock, the sheriff could caution, the neighbors could whisper, but the stones were real. They were here, and no one's laughter could erase that. The storm the night before had rattled the farmhouse until every board seemed to groan in protest. Claire spent the morning checking the outbuilding for damage, her boots sinking into the soft ground as she walked from one leaning structure to another. The barns had always felt like tired guardians, weather but standing, yet after the storm their weakness showed more clearly. One corner beam of the smaller shed had split under the pressure of wind and rain, the wood dark and wet around the crack. She pressed her hand against it, feeling how easily the surface gave, and knew she would have to brace it before the whole wall sagged further. Fetching a hammer and chisel from the porch, she returned and set to work, though it splintered reluctantly, breaking apart in pieces that smelled of age and damp earth. As she pried at the beam, something unexpected slid forward, wedged in the hollow center where no one had looked in decades. It was a parcel, no larger than her hand, wrapped tightly in layers of oilcloth darkened with time. She froze, her breath catching, then carefully drew it out, brushing away cobwebs and flakes of wood that clung to its surface. The cloth was stiff, edges hardened with age, but it had done its work well. When she unwound the layers, the object within emerged intact. A letter folded neatly, its paper yellow but still strong, the ink faded to brown. She held it gingerly, her fingers trembling, afraid it might disintegrate at her touch. The date in the corner read July 12th, 1929. Her eyes widened. This was her grandfather's era, perhaps even written by his hand. She unfolded it slowly, her pulse quickening as she began to read. The script was careful, measured, the handwriting she remembered from the ledger, though slightly younger, less worn by time. To whomever finds this, it began, asterisk, know that what we have done was not done lightly. The vault must remain hidden, for it holds more than this farm alone. It holds a safeguard of families, of debts paid and promises made. Should it be uncovered, let it be by blood who remembers, not by those who mock or destroy. Asterisk. Claire stopped, the words blurring for a moment as her throat tightened. The vault. Her grandfather had written of it openly here, not coded, not disguised in symbols, but as if speaking across generations to someone like her. She read on. Asterisk. The east field bears a mark. The stones set there not of our hands, but were entrusted to us. Guard them well. One day, another will walk the rows and understand. If you are that one, trust the land. It remembers what men forget. Asterisk. Her eyes lingered on the closing line, a simple signature, Elias Whitaker. She folded the letter again, pressing it to her chest, the oilcloth line discarded at her feet. The shed around her seemed suddenly smaller. The broken beam no longer just a weakness in structure, but the hiding place of a message meant to survive storms, time, and silence. She imagined Elias placing it there, wrapping it carefully, sliding into the hollow beam where only chance and persistence would one day reveal it. He had written not for himself, not even for his children perhaps, but for someone who would still believe in the way of the land when others dismissed it. For her. Her husband's mocking words rose unbidden in her mind, worthless fantasy, ghosts. She clenched the letter tighter. The vault was not a fantasy. It was real, acknowledged by her grandfather in his own hand nearly a century ago. The cistern, the stones, the ledger, the mismatched maps, all of it led here, to this confirmation. Claire tucked the letter back into its cloth, smoothing the folds as best she could. She knew better than to share it with her husband. He would tear it apart, laugh at it, maybe even burn it. No, this had to remain between her and the land, between her and the memory of those who had trusted her to keep looking. When she returned to the house, she slipped the letter into the ledger, the two artifacts fitting together like halves of the same story. She set them on the table, staring at them until the light shifted and the kitchen grew dim. The words echoed in her mind. Steady and sure, the vault must remain hidden. The east field bears a mark. For the first time, she felt not just the weight of history, but the clarity of purpose. Her grandfather had left her a trail, and she was no longer stumbling in the dark. The vault existed. The stones were its doorway, and she would not stop until she uncovered what the land had guarded for nearly 100 years. The barn at night was a place of echoes and shadows, its timbers creaking in the wind like old bones remembering their strain. Claire moved carefully across the packed dirt floor, her lantern casting a muted glow that stretched long between the posts. She had waited until her husband's truck rumbled down the lane, knowing he would be gone drinking with friends until dawn. The letter from 1929 still burned in her mind, its words refusing to let her rest. The vault, the stones, the east field. Yet the ledger suggested more than just the orchard. Its symbols aligned here, too, beneath the barn her great-grandfather had raised with his own hands. Her cousin Matthew followed close behind, his boots quiet against the dirt, his shoulders hunched as though afraid the beams might lean closer if he made a sound. He had been the only one she dared tell, the only one who remembered their grandmother's stories without rolling his eyes. He carried a spade and a crowbar, and though his expression was wary, he did not question her when she pointed to the place where two ledger symbols overlapped in her notes. Here, she whispered, setting the lantern down so the light spilled across the center of the floor. This is where it lines up. Matthew frowned, crouching low. It just looks like dirt to me. You're sure about this? As sure as I can be, she answered, already pushing the spade into the ground. The soil gave way reluctantly, hard-packed by years of hooves and boots, but the rhythm of digging soon steadied her breath. Matthew joined in, his movements efficient, the crowbar scraping loose clumps when a spade could not cut deep enough. The lantern light flickered, throwing their shadows against the walls. Two bent figures working in near silence. Dust rose in thin clouds, coating their throats, but still they dug. The hole widened slowly, the barn floor scarred by their determination. Every so often Matthew muttered about the foolishness of it, about how they could be caught, about how her husband would lose his mind if he knew. But each time, Claire pressed on, her hands raw, her arms aching, her conviction unshaken. An hour passed before Matthew's spade struck something solid. The sound rang different than earth or stone, a sharp clink that reverberated through the soil. They froze, eyes meeting in the dim light. He crouched, brushing away dirt with his fingers until the edge of a block emerged. Smooth, pale, deliberate. "It's the same as the orchard," Claire whispered, her voice trembling with both fatigue and awe. "Limestone, cut and set. It's not natural." Together they cleared more, revealing the edges of fitted blocks beneath the dirt floor. The stones formed a line, precise and straight, vanishing deeper into the ground. Claire pressed her palm against the cool surface, her breath catching at the realization that the ledger's marks were true. This was no coincidence. Her grandfather had known exactly what lay here. Matthew sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his brow. "Well, I'll be damned. You were right. But what now? We can't just tear up the whole barn." "We don't have to. We just keep going," she said, determination sharpening her voice. "We find where it leads." They dug until their arms felt heavy as lead, until the lantern's flames sputtered low. The soil gave way slowly, but inch by inch, more of the stonework revealed itself. It wasn't a foundation. It was a wall, angled downward, as if marking an entrance buried long ago. At last, exhaustion forced them to stop. They sat side by side on the barn floor, breathing hard, their clothes streaked with dirt, their hands raw. The lantern's weak glow lit the exposed stones, smooth and unwavering, their presence undeniable. Matthew broke the silence first. "If there's a vault here, it's bigger than just a family secret. Somebody went to a lot of trouble to hide it. You sure you want to keep going? Once it's found, you can't take it back." Claire looked at the stones, her chest rising and falling. She thought her grandmother's Bible, her grandfather's ledger, the letter hidden in the beam. All of them pointed here, to this night, to this discovery. She nodded slowly. "I have to. This farm isn't worthless. They left something for me to find, and I won't stop now." The lantern hissed, the barn groaned, and outside the wind swept across the dark fields. Beneath the dirt, the stones waited, patient and silent, as if guarding the secrets that had lain undisturbed for nearly a century. Claire and Matthew covered the hole as best they could, pulling loose soil back into place, tamping it down until the scars of their work faded into the floor. When they finally stepped out into the night, the stars above seemed brighter, sharper, the air colder against their skin. They walked back toward the farmhouse in silence, both knowing that what they had uncovered was only the beginning. The vault was real, and now, nothing could convince her otherwise. The next evening, with the memory of their midnight work still fresh, Claire and Matthew returned to the barn. They carried a stronger lantern this time, along with shovels and gloves, their movements deliberate and quiet. The floor looked the same as it always had, flat and unremarkable, but they both knew what lay beneath. The soil they disturbed had settled unevenly, leaving a faint outline that seemed to beckon them back. Claire felt the weight of the letter in her pocket, her grandfather's words about the vault echoing in her mind. They dug with more confidence now, the soil loosening more easily than it had the night before. The lantern light glinted off flecks of stone dust as they worked, each strike of the spade carrying them deeper into the earth. The air inside the barn grew thick, filled with the smell of damp dirt and old timber, but neither slowed. They were driven by the sense that the ground itself was on the verge of yielding its secret. It was Matthew who struck it first. His shovel made a dull metallic scrape, the sound cutting sharply through the muffled quiet. He froze, his eyes flicking Claire. Together they knelt, brushing aside the soil with their hands until the outline of a box emerged. It was small, no larger than a bread loaf, its surface mottled with rust, the iron weakened but still holding form. The corners were rough, edges corroded by decades underground, yet it remained sealed tight. Claire's hands trembled as she lifted it free of the earth. The weight surprised her. It was heavier than it looked, solid in a way that promised something more than trinkets. She set it on the ground between them, the lantern glow reflecting off its pitted surface. Matthew fetched the crowbar, prying carefully at the lock, which had long since fused into a crust of rust. It groaned, resisted, then snapped, the sound sharp in the still barn. The lid creaked open, releasing a faint musty smell of old paper and metal that had lain untouched for decades. Inside, they found no gold or jewels, but a neatly arranged collection of folded papers, bound with brittle string. Claire lifted the bundle with both hands, untying the string with painstaking care. The first sheets were deeds, parchments dated from the 1800s, detailing transfers of land. Acreages scrawled in precise script, signatures of names she recognized from her family's history. Beneath the deeds lay promissory notes, some stamped and sealed, referencing loans paid and unpaid, promises that stretched between families she knew and others she had only heard mentioned in passing. The deeper she sorted, the more she realized these were not random papers but a record, a history of transactions that tied the farm to something larger. And then she found the final envelope, its paper brown but intact. She opened it slowly, her breath catching as she read the lines inside. It spoke not of crops or debts, but of deposits, funds hidden away, secured beneath stone, beyond the reach of fire or flood. The language was careful, almost coded, but clear enough to suggest there were caches of money or valuables still concealed on the land. Claire looked up at Matthew, her hand shaking. This isn't just family records. They hid things. Not just here, but somewhere close. They left a trail. Matthew leaned back, rubbing his jaw, his expression shifting from skepticism to something more solemn. If this is true, Claire, then this farm's worth a hell of a lot more than anyone thinks. These papers, they're proof. She nodded, though her thoughts were already racing ahead. The vault her grandfather had written about, the stones beneath the east field, the ledger's symbols, all of it tied to what they now held. This lockbox was not the treasure itself, but a map of sorts, evidence that the land had been used as more than a farm. It had been a repository, a safeguard, a place where wealth was hidden and protected through generations. She folded the papers carefully, placing them back inside the box. Her heart pounded with both awe and dread. If her husband found out, he would waste no time selling everything, shouting to the world what they had uncovered, turning her family's secret into a bargaining chip for his own gain. She could not let that happen. This was hers to protect, entrusted by those who came before her. Together, she and Matthew covered the hole once more, tamping the dirt flat until barn floor looked undisturbed. The lockbox they carried with them, hidden beneath Claire's coat as they crossed the yard. The night air was cool against her face, but she hardly felt it. She clutched the weight of the box close, its rusted shell pressing into her ribs like a heartbeat from another time. Back inside the farmhouse, she set it gently on the table beside the ledger and the oil-wrapped letter. The three artifacts sat together, silent and unassuming, yet heavy with meaning. She traced her fingers over them, her conviction deepening. The farm was not worthless. It was a vault, just as her grandfather had written, and she was the one who had been chosen to unlock it. The lockbox sat on the kitchen table, its rusted shell dull under the weak glow of the overhead light. Claire had laid out some of the contents in neat rows, careful not to smudge the fragile ink. The deeds and notes looked like brittle leaves collected from another age, yet she felt their weight as if they were stone. Matthew had left only an hour before, his parting words urging her to keep them safe, hidden from prying eyes. She had promised him she would, but promises were difficult to keep in a house where distrust walked the same floors. Her husband came in later than usual, the smell of beer clinging to his coat, his steps heavy as though daring the floorboards to protest. He dropped his keys onto the counter with a loud clatter, his eyes immediately catching the spread of papers on the table. He smirked, shaking his head as he walked closer, the sound of his boots deliberate, mocking. Well, he drawled, leaning over the table. What's this then? More of your ghost stories? Don't tell me you've dragged poor Matthew into your little treasure hunt. He always did have more patience for nonsense than sense. Claire didn't answer at first. She stood by the stove, her hands gripping the edge of the counter to steady herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, calm despite the knot in her throat. They're not stories. These are deeds, promissory notes, records hidden for a reason. They prove the farm isn't what you think it is. He barked out a laugh, the sound sharp and cruel. Deeds? Promissory notes? Worthless scraps of paper from people long dead. You think the bank's going to hand us $50 million because you found some old signatures? You think the county's going to rewrite history because you dragged a box out of the dirt? My God, Claire, you've lost your mind. She stepped closer, trying to hold his gaze. Read them. Look at the names, the dates. They reference deposits. Things hidden. It ties into everything. Before she could finish, he snatched one of the papers from the table, the edges tearing slightly in his grip. He glanced at it, scoffing. This is what you're pinning our lives on? Scribbles on yellow paper? When she reached to take it back, he pulled away, the smirk deepening. Then, in a sudden motion, he tore it down the center. The sound of the paper ripping filled the kitchen, louder to her ears than any storm. She gasped, reaching for the halves, but he let them fall carelessly to the floor. There, that's about what it's worth, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. Nothing, just like this farm. Nothing but worthless dirt, and now worthless paper to match. You'd rather bury yourself in this junk than face reality. Investors are coming, Claire. They'll see what I see, and then we'll be rid of this place for good. Her knees nearly buckled as she bent to gather the torn pieces, her hands shaking. She pressed them together, as if by holding the edges close she could erase the damage. Her eyes burned, not from tears or from fury held tight inside her chest. He grabbed his coat again, muttering under his breath, "Chasing shadows. That's all you are, chasing shadows while the rest of us try to live." The door slammed behind him, rattling the old frame. Silence spread through the kitchen, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the faint rustle of the torn paper in her hands. She sat at the table, staring at the scattered documents, the weight of his laughter still heavy in the air. But as she laid the torn sheet alongside the others, her anger hardened into something steadier. He could laugh. He could mock. He could tear paper in half and storm away. But he could not erase the stone she had touched with her own hands, the sealed cistern, the letter her grandfather had hidden in the barn. The truth was larger than his contempt, stronger than his scorn. She smoothed the torn pieces flat on the table and set the rusted lockbox back over them, as if shielding them from further harm. Her husband's laughter still echoed faintly in her ears, but she no longer felt shaken. If anything, it was a reminder. The vault was real. The paper was proof. And she would protect it, even if she had to do so alone. The next morning, Claire rose before dawn, her body heavy from a night without sleep. The torn paper weighed on her mind as much as the rusted lockbox itself, its ripped edges pressed flat under the weight of the old ledger. She could still hear her husband's laughter, the rip of the document echoing in her ears. Yet the inked signatures, the embossed seal, those had not left her thoughts. She needed someone outside the farm, someone who could tell her if her instincts were right. With careful hands, she slipped the torn sheet into a manila envelope, wrapping it in parchment so it would not suffer further damage. She set out before her husband stirred, driving into town with the envelope on the passenger seat, her fingers brushing it every so often as if to reassure herself it was still there. The bank sat on the corner of Main Street, a building of stone and glass that had weathered a century of commerce. Inside, the air was cool, filled with the quiet murmur of low voices and the rustle of paper. Claire waited in line, the envelope clutched tightly in her hands, her pulse quickening with each step forward. When her turn came, she approached the counter where a clerk she recognized, Mr. Daniels, a man in his 50s with spectacles perched low on his nose, looked up at her with polite detachment. "What can I do for you today, Mrs. Carson?" he asked, adjusting his glasses. She slid the envelope across the counter, her voice low. "I need you to look at this. It's old for my family's farm. My husband tore it, but I think it might be important." He raised an eyebrow but opened the envelope carefully, unfolding the fragile halves of the document. At first his expression was simply one of curiosity, the same practiced look of someone who had seen countless deeds and papers brought in by hopeful customers. But then his eyes sharpened. He leaned closer, holding the torn sheet under the lamp on his desk. His breath caught audibly, a small sound that made Claire's stomach twist. "My God," he whispered, almost to himself. Do you know what this is? Claire shook her head, afraid to speak. This, he said slowly, his finger tracing the faded print, is an original stock certificate, Carnegie Steel Company, issued before the merger that formed U.S. Steel. The signatures, these are authentic. Even torn, it carries value. Preserved, intact, it could be worth, he broke off, staring at her with wide eyes. Mrs. Carson, do you realize you may be sitting on millions of dollars worth of assets if there are more like this? The words hit her like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knees weak. Millions, she whispered. He nodded, still studying the certificate with reverence. These documents weren't just stored, they were hidden. People in the 1920s and 30s sometimes bought certificates as private wealth, tucking them away in vaults or safe houses. If your family held on to these, if they never sold or redeemed them, their value today would be unimaginable. Collectors, corporations, even museums would pay extraordinary sums. Claire's mind spun. She thought of the lockbox, the promissory notes, the deeds. If one torn certificate carried that much value, what the rest? Her grandfather's letter about the vault echoed in her ears. The safeguard of families, of debts paid and promises made. Daniels lowered his voice, glancing around before leaning closer. You must keep this safe. Do not let anyone mishandle it again. Bring the rest, carefully. And Mrs. Carson, tell no one you don't trust. If word of this spreads, you'll have people crawling over that farm before you know it. Claire nodded numbly, tucking the certificate back into its envelope. Her hand shook as she held it close, her mind ablaze with both fear and clarity. Her husband's laughter, his scorn, the sound of the paper tearing. All of it now seemed like the hollow noise of a man too blind to see what stood before him. The truth was here, undeniable, stamped in ink and sealed by history. As she walked back to her truck, the weight of the envelope against her chest felt heavier than before, but no longer uncertain. The vault was real, and its worth had begun to show itself. What her husband had dismissed as worthless paper was, in fact, a key to fortune, and it was hers to protect. The historian arrived on a gray afternoon, summoned not by invitation but by curiosity. Word in a small town traveled quietly but fast, and the sight of Claire carrying an old envelope into bank had not gone unnoticed. By evening, Mr. Grady at the fence already knew, and by the next day, Dr. Harold Bell, the historian who had first recognized the symbols in her grandfather's ledger, appeared at her door. He carried no satchel this time, only a folder tucked beneath his arm and an expression both grave and intrigued. Claire welcomed him into the kitchen, the lockbox and its papers already spread across the table, like an exhibit prepared for judgment. He stood over them for a long moment, his fingertips hovering above the brittle documents as though afraid even to touch. At last, he drew out a pair of thin gloves from his coat pocket and slipped them on, his eyes narrowing as he examined the torn stock certificate, the promissory notes, the old deeds. You weren't exaggerating, he murmured, his voice low but charged with a weight that filled the room. These aren't just family records. This is a web of financial history, pieces that don't belong together unless there was intent. And I believe there was. Claire sat across from him, her hands folded tightly to keep them from trembling. The bank clerk said the certificate alone could be worth millions today. He said there might be more. Bell nodded slowly. Yes, but it's not only the value of the paper itself. It's the story behind it, the chain of ownership. And that story points to something larger. Tell me, did your grandfather ever speak of the war years? Not the fields or the droughts, but the financial struggles, the whispers of money hidden away? She thought back, searching her memory. Her grandfather had been a quiet man, more comfortable with the soil than with words. But she remembered the silences, the way he sometimes paused over the ledger as though listening for voices she could not hear. Not directly, she said softly, but the letter I found spoke of deposits, of something meant to be safeguarded. Bell laid the certificate gently back on the table, his brow furrowing. Then I think I can piece it together. During the First World War, and especially leading into the Depression, wealthy families and even companies sought to protect assets in case of collapse or seizure. They funneled money into private hands, into farms, into vaults disguised as cellars or cisterns. Some of it was meant to evade taxes, some to keep wealth out of government reach. Steel companies in particular moved fortunes this way, fearing the volatility of the markets. If your family held stock certificates from Carnegie Steel, unredeemed, hidden and preserved, then they were entrusted with a fortune few remembered even existed. The word seemed to thicken the air. Claire felt the enormity of it pressing against her chest, both exhilarating and terrifying. You're saying my grandfather was part of this? That he was trusted with wealth that wasn't even his? Trusted, Belle repeated firmly. He may have been a caretaker. Someone chose the Whitakers because they were rooted to this land, because they would endure. The ledgers, the notes, the symbols, they weren't nonsense. They were instructions, markers left to ensure the vault was never lost. The war ended, fortunes shifted, and people died, but your family kept the secret. Claire glanced toward the window, where the field stretched silent and indifferent under the gray sky. To her husband, it was worthless dirt. To her, it had become a burden heavy with voices of the past. Now, hearing the historian's words, she felt it turn into something else entirely. A responsibility tied not just to her bloodline, but to forgotten promises made in desperate times. Bell leaned closer, his voice dropping. If this is indeed a wartime deposit, its recovery won't be simple. There will be legal questions, claims contested, perhaps even federal interest. But make no mistake, this is no fantasy. What you found to be the key to unlocking one of the forgotten fortunes of this region. And if the vault itself is intact, if it still holds what was placed there, the worth could be beyond anything you've imagined. The kitchen clock ticked softly between them, marking the pause as his words settled like dust in the air. Claire sat motionless, her hands resting on the table near the torn certificate. She thought of her grandmother's note in the Bible, of the cistern beneath the orchard, of the carved limestone blocks revealed by her spade. Each clue had pulled her deeper into a story she had not asked to inherit, but could no longer deny. When Bell finally rose to leave, he placed one gloved hand lightly on the lockbox. "Guard this carefully," he said. "Your husband may laugh, neighbors may scoff, but history rarely reveals itself so clearly. This is your family's legacy, Mrs. Carson. And perhaps more than that, it may be a legacy for the nation itself." As the historian stepped out into the gray afternoon, Claire stood at the doorway, clutching the edge of the frame. The wind rolled across the fields, carrying with it silence, so deep it felt like listening to the earth itself. She understood now what her grandfather had meant. Trust the land, for it remembers. And beneath her feet, it remembered still. The engineer arrived in a white truck with the name of his firm stenciled faintly on the door, the kind of vehicle that looked more at home at a highway construction site than at the edge of a farm road. Claire had not told her husband. She arranged the visit quietly, calling a favor through Matthew, who knew someone who had done work for the county. The man who stepped out was broad-shouldered, sunburned along the neck, and carried a surveyor's kit with the ease of someone who had spent years pulling it from the bed of a truck. His name was Thomas Keene, and he introduced himself in a voice both practical and polite, without the smirk or disbelief she had grown used to encountering. He followed her across the field with steady strides, boots sinking slightly in the soil softened by rain. The east field stretched wide, the orchard visible in the distance, the tree with the sealed cistern standing like a lone marker. Claire pointed out the area where her grandmother's Bible had directed her, the very ground her husband called barren and useless. Keene set down his kit and began laying out instruments with quiet precision. Ground-penetrating radar, stakes, a reel of measuring tape. "This won't take long," he said, adjusting the antenna of the device. "If there's anything under the surface, walls, voids, foundations, we'll know soon enough." Claire stood back, arms folded tightly against the wind, watching as he guided the radar sled slowly across the soil. The machine gave a low hum, lines appearing on the small screen he carried. Each pass he made he marked carefully, driving stakes into ground and tying them with twine, mapping out the field in measured strides. Minutes turned into an hour, the hum of the machine steady, the screen flickering with patterns Claire could not decipher. She waited, her heart pressing harder with each pause as Keene studied the readings. Finally, at one of the markers, he stopped, His brow furrowed as he adjusted the controls, running the sled across the same stretch again and again. "There's something here," he said at last, motioning her closer. He pointed at the screen where a dark shape disrupted the uniform lines. "See that? That's not natural soil. That's void space, like an underground chamber. And the depth, about 12 feet down. The shape suggests masonry walls." Claire felt her throat tighten, her breath quickening. "A chamber?" He nodded, his eyes still on the screen. "Yes, large, rectangular. And there's more. On the edges, the signature suggests heavy material, stone or reinforced brick. This was built to last." She knelt beside him, staring at the faint outline glowing across the display. The vault her grandfather had written about, the stones beneath the field her grandmother had hinted at, the very thing she had uncovered piece by piece. It was here, confirmed not by rumor or hope but by science. Keen straightened, dusting soil from his hands. "Whoever built this wanted it hidden. No agricultural purpose I can see. No cistern, no root cellar. This is deliberate. A constructed chamber sealed beneath a farm field, and it's still intact." For a moment, Claire could not speak. She thought of her husband's laughter, the torn certificate, the lockbox, the historian's grave certainty. All of it led here, to the earth beneath her boots. She pressed her hand against the soil, as though trying to feel the chamber below. "What happens next?" she asked quietly. The engineer packed away his equipment, careful and deliberate. "That depends on you. Excavation will be difficult, and once it begins, it won't stay secret. Word gets out fast in a place like this. But Mrs. Carson, I can tell you with absolute certainty, there is a buried chamber under this field. Whatever your family left here, it's waiting." As he drove away, the twine markers swayed gently in the breeze, outlining a rectangle in the grass. Claire stood alone, staring at the stakes that framed the hidden space beneath. For years, she had carried her family's memory as if it were a burden mocked and dismissed. Now, confirmed by machines and measurements, she knew the truth was real. The vault was not only a story, not only a whisper in old ledgers and Bibles. It was stone and mortar, sealed in silence, waiting for her hands to bring it into the light. By the time Claire marked a rectangle in the east field with small flags, the tension in the farmhouse had reached a breaking point. The engineer's survey had confirmed what she already knew in her bones. There was a chamber below. She moved with new determination, gathering tools, speaking with Matthew about hiring discreet labor, making plans for excavation. Her husband, however, had noticed the changes. The whispered phone calls, the dirt on her boots, the quiet defiance in her eyes. The discovery that had filled her with resolve filled him only with dread, and dread quickly turned to rage. He confronted her first in the kitchen, where the lockbox still rested on the table. He slammed his fist against the wood so hard the papers inside jumped. "Enough of this nonsense, Claire. Do you hear me? Enough. You've turned this farm into a circus with your digging and your stories. People are starting to talk. You're going to make fools out of both of us." She stood at the counter, drying her hands on a towel, her face calm though her heart beat fast. "It isn't nonsense. I've seen the stones, I've seen the papers, and now the engineer confirmed there's a chamber under the field. You can't deny it anymore." He sneered, his voice rising. "An engineer with a fancy machine and too much time on his hands. You think that proves anything? Chambers, stones, ledgers. It's all in your head. You're chasing ghosts while our real life, our future, slips away. What happens when investors come and see this mess? Do you think they'll want to buy a farm with a wife tearing up the land like she's digging for pirate treasure?" Her grip on the towel tightened. "This isn't about investors. This is about family, about what was left here for us. For me, you can laugh and shout, but you can't erase what's in the ground." His face reddened, his voice breaking into a shout. "You'll embarrass me. Do you understand that? You'll ruin me in front of this whole county. They already think we're nothing but farmers too stubborn to leave the dirt behind. And now you want to dig holes, tell stories of hidden vaults? They'll laugh us out of town." Claire stepped forward, her eyes meeting his without flinching. "They already laugh at us. They laugh at you when you brag about selling what you don't understand. But I won't let their voices drown out the truth. I won't let yours either. He grabbed the lockbox, lifting it as if to hurl it across the room, then hesitated, his knuckles white against the rusted lid. This box, these scraps, they've poisoned you. You're delusional, Claire. Completely delusional. And if you keep going, I'll stop you myself. She held his gaze, her voice steady. Then you'll have to try. Because I'm not stopping. For a long moment, they stood locked in silence, the old house creaking around them. Finally, with a growl, he set the lockbox down hard, the sound echoing like a gavel. He stormed toward the door, his boots striking the floor with each step. Outside, she watched through the window as he paced the porch, running a hand through his hair in frustration. His rage was not only at her, but at his own fear. The fear of being mocked, of being left behind, of having no control over what the land might reveal. She saw it plainly now. He wanted to sell, to escape, to hide behind money and forget. But she wanted the truth, no matter how much dirt it demanded. When he finally drove off in a spray of gravel, the field lay quiet again, its flags marking the hidden chamber like silent witnesses. Claire placed her hand on the lockbox, her resolve unshaken by his fury. Rage could break dishes, slam doors, tear paper in half. But it could not reach beneath the earth. The vault waited, indifferent to shouting, untouched by laughter or scorn. And she would uncover it, whether her husband stood beside her or against her. The morning the excavation began, the east field looked like a battlefield of anticipation. Matthew had brought 2 men he trusted, locals who knew how to keep quiet and how to work without asking questions they didn't need answered. Their truck rumbled into the lane at first light, hauling equipment too heavy for Claire to imagine using on her own. Shovels, picks, and a small backhoe were unloaded, the clatter of metal against metal carrying across the still air. The men spoke little, their eyes sharp and curious, but disciplined enough not to pry. The flagged rectangle in the field became their focus. Claire stood at its edge, her hands clenched tight in her coat pockets, watching as the first cuts into the soil were made. The backhoe bit into the earth, scooping out dark soil and lifting it aside in heavy arcs. The smell of freshly turned ground filled the air, rich and damp, like a promise stirred awake. With each pass, the hole deepened, the hum of the engine steady and purposeful. By mid-morning, the bucket struck something solid. The sound rang louder than the steady scrape of dirt, a blunt knock that caused the operator to lift his head sharply. He backed the machine away, and the men went in with shovels, their movements careful, deliberate. Bit by bit, they exposed the edges of something pale and unyielding beneath the soil. Claire dropped to her knees, brushing away dirt with her hands. What emerged was not loose stone, not a scattering of rocks, but a single expanse of limestone, smooth across its surface despite the years underground. She traced its line outward, realizing quickly it extended far beyond what they had uncovered. The men cleared more soil, revealing corners cut with precision, edges too exact for nature. "It's a slab," one of the workers said under his breath, stepping back as though giving it space. It was larger than she had imagined, a massive sheet of limestone fitted so tightly that no soil had seeped between its edges. Along the perimeter, faint shapes gleamed beneath the dirt, iron clamps, thick and corroded but still locking the stone in place. Claire ran her fingers over one, the metal rough and pitted, yet strong enough to have endured decades, perhaps a century, without surrendering. Matthew crouched beside her, his face pale in the weak sunlight. Someone didn't just bury this. They sealed it, deliberately. Claire nodded, her throat tight. "This is the vault. It has to be." The men cleared further, widened the hole until the entire slab lay exposed. It measured at least 12 feet across, a rectangle set flush against the soil, its weight alone a barrier no farmer with a plow could ever hope to disturb. The clamps were spaced evenly, hammered deep into stone and anchored with a purpose that made clear this was no makeshift hiding place. Whoever had built it had intended it to remain closed until the right hands pried it open. For hours, they worked around it, brushing the last traces of soil away, the slab emerging like a monument risen from the earth. Claire stood at its edge, the wind tugging at her coat, her heart pounding with each revelation. Her grandmother's words, her grandfather's letter, The ledger, the historian's warnings, all of it pointed here, to this moment. The chamber beneath was real, and the proof lay before her in stone and iron. As dusk settled, the men leaned on their shovels, sweat streaking their faces, their voices low with awe. No one spoke of what might be inside. Not yet. The slab itself demanded reverence. Claire crouched once more, her hand pressed against the cool limestone, feeling its steadiness against her skin. She whispered to herself, not caring if the others heard. They wanted it safe. They wanted it remembered. The clamps gleamed faintly in the fading light, silent sentinels over whatever waited below. And though exhaustion pulled at her bones, Claire felt more alive than she ever had. The vault was no longer rumor or family tale. It was here, solid and undeniable, sealed in stone, waiting to be opened. The next morning the air carried a chill that clung to the skin, as though the land itself understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. The limestone slab lay exposed in the east field, its surface washed clean of soil by the night's damp. The iron clamps glistened faintly with moisture, dark streaks of rust running from their edges. Claire stood over it with Matthew at her side, their boots leaving shallow impressions in the damp earth. The two hired men returned as promised, their eyes sharp with curiosity, but their silence intact. Tools had been gathered, crowbars, hammers, chisels, even a small hydraulic jack borrowed from a garage in town. The work began at first light. Metal rang against stone as they pried at the clamps, each one reluctant to release after decades of holding fast. The sound echoed across the field, a rhythm of strikes and groans, punctuated by the occasional hiss of breath when rust flaked away in stubborn shards. One by one the clamps gave, breaking loose with sharp cracks until they lay discarded in the dirt like relics of forgotten guard. With the clamps removed, the slab itself became their focus. It was heavier than any of them had imagined, its weight pressing down with the full force of a century. The jack was set against its edge, pumping slowly, forcing the stone to shift by inches. Every creak and shudder seemed amplified, as though the earth resisted the intrusion. Claire watched with her hands clenched tight, her breath shallow, as the gap widened enough for men to slip crowbars underneath. Together, with grunts of effort, they levered the slab upward until the hollow sound of air rushing out from below broke the silence. The scent that followed was sharp and stale, a mixture of earth, iron, and something metallic that had been sealed too long. The lantern was lowered first, its light spilling into the darkness below. A rough stairway appeared, cut from stone and braced with timber, descending into shadow. The men stepped back, waiting for her word. Claire descended first, the lantern held high. Each step creaked under her weight but held firm, though it darkened with age yet steady. The chamber at the bottom opened wider than she expected, its walls lined with stone, its ceiling low enough that Matthew had to stoop when he followed. Dust motes drifted in the lantern's glow, swirling in the stale air. Then her eyes caught them, crates, stacked in rows against the far wall. They were uniform in size, they would age but intact, each stencil with markings faded but still legible. Claire approached slowly, the lantern trembling in her hand. She brushed away grime with her sleeve, and there it was. The insignia of a bank she recognized from history books, embossed letters reading First Continental Trust, 1931. Her breath caught, her voice breaking into a whisper. It's real! Matthew ran his hand over another crate, tracing the same insignia. Some bore numbers, others only symbols, but all carried the same stamp of origin. He turned to her, his face pale in the lamplight. Claire, these aren't just family keepsakes. These are bank deposits. Sealed. Hidden. The two men who had helped lift the slab descended cautiously, their eyes wide. One muttered under his breath, as though unwilling to give voice to the weight of the sight before him. The crates filled nearly half the chamber, their presence overwhelming. Claire placed a lantern in the top one, the flame flickering against the markings. She thought her grandfather's letter, of his words about safeguarding families and promises made. She thought of the historian's warning about wartime deposits, of fortunes entrusted to those who would endure. Every step of her search had led here, to this moment when the earth itself yielded proof that the Whitakers had carried a trust larger than their own survival. Her hands trembled as she pressed against the lid of the nearest crate. the wood groaned but held firm, nailed shut in a way that suggested permanence. She stepped back, unwilling to force it open yet. The chamber already told its story, without revealing its contents. They stood in silence, the lanterns casting long shadows across the stone walls, the crates looming like a silent audience. Claire felt the weight of history pressing down, heavier than the limestone slab they had removed. She knew that once these crates were opened, there would be no returning to the quiet life she had once imagined. The vault had revealed itself, and with it, a fortune tied not just to her family, but to the echoes of a world that had hidden its wealth beneath the soil of an ordinary farm. When they finally climbed back into the daylight, the air felt sharper, the sky brighter. Behind them, the chamber waited, its crates lined in patient silence. Claire stood at the edge of the hole, staring down, her hands clenched with resolve. The vault was no longer a whisper in old ledgers or a mocking phrase in her husband's mouth. It was stone and timber, iron and wood, marked with the insignia of a bank that had long since vanished. And now, it was hers to guard, hers to uncover, one crate at a time. The news spread faster than Claire had hoped. It began with the hired men who had helped shift the slab. They swore they would keep silent, but a glance, a whispered remark at the diner, was enough. By the next morning, curious eyes followed her truck into town. Whispers thickened into questions, and before long the sheriff himself appeared at the edge of the east field, his cruiser pulling up slow, his face unreadable behind the brim of his hat. Not long after, Dr. Harold Bell returned, summoned by the same rumors, his coat collar pulled high against the wind as he crossed the pasture. By afternoon, neighbors began to gather, too, Grady leaning against his fence line, others drifting closer, their voices low, their gazes fixed on the open earth. The slab had been pushed aside, and the chamber below was no longer a secret. A rope pulley rig had been set up, crude but functional, lowering men down to secure the crates and haul them up one by one. The sheriff stood with his hands on his hips, watching in silence as the first crate emerged from the darkness, as with groaning against the strain of age. The insignia of the long-defunct bank showed clear under the afternoon sun, and for a moment no one spoke. Bell was the first to break the silence. He stepped closer, adjusting his spectacles, his breath visible in the cool air. "It's exactly as I suspected," he said, his voice carrying to those gathered. Deposits, sealed away during the economic storms of the 30s. Families entrusted these banks, and when the banks collapsed or merged, fortunes vanished into paper. But here, he trailed off, his eyes wide. Here it appears they were never lost. The sheriff knelt, brushing dirt from the side of the crate with his thick hands. He looked up at Claire, his expression somewhere between caution and awe. "You know what this means, don't you? Folks are going to want answers. Some of these names, some of these deposits, they may not have belonged to your family." Claire nodded slowly, her chest tight. "I know, but my family kept them safe for nearly a century." Another crate rose in the chamber, the pulley creaking, ropes straining under the weight. This one bore a number stenciled in faded ink alongside the same bank insignia. A murmur passed through the small crowd of neighbors, men shifting their caps, women clutching coats tighter against their shoulders. They had come expecting rumor, and now they watched as history surfaced in wooden boxes. One man in the crowd whispered, "Fortune in the dirt," just like the old stories. His words carried, and others nodded, their eyes fixed on a growing line of crates at the field's edge. The historian stepped forward again, his voice steadier now, more measured. "These aren't mere curiosities. They are records of wealth deliberately hidden, preserved in a vault fashioned to outlast its keepers. This field, this farm, was a stronghold. What we are witnessing is not just the recovery of property, but the resurfacing of forgotten history." The sheriff turned to the crowd, his tone firm. "This is still private land. What's found here is to be respected until we understand what we're dealing with. No one crosses that rope without permission." His words settled the group, though their eyes still linger hungrily on the crates. As the day wore on, more boxes emerged, each one met with the same collective breath held and released. They were stacked carefully at the edge of the excavation, their markings catalogued by Bell, who scribbled furiously in a notebook. The townsfolk remained, unwilling to leave, their faces lit with a mixture of awe, envy, and disbelief. The field had become a stage, the crates its actors, and every eye bore witness. Claire stood at the center of it all, her hands folded tightly, her heart pounding with each groan of the ropes. Her husband's mocking words seemed far away now, drowned beneath the creak of pulleys and the gasp of neighbors. What she had unearthed was no fantasy. It was wood, iron, and ink, stamped with names and symbols that carried the weight of decades. When the final crate of the day was set down, the sun was already low, the field bathed in amber light. The sheriff, the historian, and the townsfolk lingered, staring at the silent row of boxes that seemed to hum with untold stories. Claire looked from face to face and saw the same realization etched into each. They were present at the unsealing of something larger than themselves, something that tied their town to a hidden thread of history. The witnesses remained quiet as the light faded, reluctant to leave, as though stepping away would mean turning their backs on the moment. And when at last they drifted back to their homes, the image of the crates followed them, destined to ripple through every conversation in town. The farm, once mocked as worthless, had spoken, and all who stood there knew they had seen the first chapter of a story still waiting to unfold. The crates were brought into the barn one by one, their weight straining the ropes and the backs of the men who carried them. They were lined neatly along the wall, the air inside thick with the scent of old wood, rust, and soil. Claire stood with Matthew, the sheriff, and Dr. Bell as the first lid was pried free with a crowbar. The sound was sharp, a splintering groan that echoed to the rafters, and when the boards fell open, the contents inside glimmered faintly in the lantern light. Bundles of paper lay stacked in rows, tied with faded ribbons, their edges brown with age but intact. Dr. Bell leaned closer, adjusting his spectacles, his hands trembling slightly. He lifted one bundle and unwrapped the ribbon. A gasp escaped him. "Bearer bonds," he whispered, "issued in the 20s. These were as good as cash, unregistered, transferable by hand. To hold one was to hold its value outright." The sheriff let out a low whistle, running a hand along his jaw. "And how much is one of those worth?" Bell thumbed through the first few sheets, the numbers printed boldly at the top. This stack alone, perhaps 500,000, maybe more, depending on condition, and the issuing company. And there are dozens more bundles here. They moved to the next crate, levering its lid free with a grunt of effort. Inside were sealed envelopes stamped with official crests. Claire lifted one, the paper stiff beneath her fingers, the wax seal crumbling slightly. She opened it carefully, revealing gold certificates, promises backed by reserves no longer in circulation, but still priceless to collectors and institutions. The historian's voice grew hushed, reverent. These were withdrawn during the Depression, ordered turned into government in 1933. To possess them now is extraordinary. Each certificate could fetch thousands, tens of thousands even, and there are hundreds here. The men worked in near silence, opening crate after crate, the air growing heavier with each discovery. Rare coins appeared next, nestled in cloth sacks marked with faded ink. When one spilled onto the table, the coins clinked against each other, their gold surfaces catching the lamplight in dull brilliance. Matthew held one up, his mouth hanging open. "St. Gaudens's double eagle," he said, repeating words he had once read in a book but never thought he would speak aloud. $20 gold coin. These alone could be worth a fortune. Dr. Bell moved methodically, stacking and recording, his voice steady now as he tallied values. Bearer bonds, 20 million at least. Gold certificates, another 10, perhaps 15. Coins, rarity and weight combined, no less than 12 to 15. Together, he paused, removing his spectacles, rubbing at his eyes before looking directly at Claire. Together, conservatively, this collection could be valued at $50 million. The barn fell silent. Even the sheriff, a man not given to dramatics, seemed struck dumb. His eyes moved from the crates to Claire, his voice slow, measured. 50 million. Sitting under your land all this time. Claire pressed a hand to the table, her breath shallow. 50 million. The number seemed unreal, too vast to comprehend. Yet the proof lay in stacks of bonds, in certificates glowing faintly under lantern light, in coins cold and heavy in her cousin's palm. All the laughter, all the mockery, all the years of being told the farm was worthless. They shattered in that moment. The land had held its secret patiently, waiting for her hands, her eyes, her faith to bring it back to light. Dr. Bell leaned forward, his tone careful. "You must understand, Mrs. Carson. These are not just valuable, they are historic. Institutions will fight to claim them. Families may emerge with stories. Governments may press questions. But for now, this is yours. Your discovery, your family's legacy." The sheriff nodded, his expression firm. "And until the dust settles, no word leaves this barn that you don't permit. Folks may suspect, but suspicion and proof are two different things." Claire looked down at the crate nearest her, the bearer bonds resting neatly inside. Their ink faded, but their promise still alive. Her hands trembled as she touched them, not from fear, but from the weight of what they represented. Not just wealth, but vindication. The farm was not barren, not worthless. It was the keeper of a fortune, the guardian of history. As lanterns flickered in the barn's stillness, Claire realized she had crossed a threshold. The land that had been mocked as a burden had revealed itself as a treasure, and she, against laughter and rage, had been the one to uncover it. $50 million sat at her feet, and with it, the undeniable proof that the soil remembered what men had forgotten. The experts arrived in plain cars with briefcases tucked under their arms. Men whose names Claire did not know, but whose reputations Dr. Bell vouched for. They were appraisers from the city, careful in dress and manner, their voices precise, their hands gloved before they touched a single page. The barn had been swept clean in preparation. The crates arranged on tables borrowed from the church hall, lanterns replaced with electric lamps that hummed faintly as they burned. It no longer looked like a farmer's outbuilding, but like a temporary vault, its rough beams sheltering wealth that had slept too long. Her husband was there, arms folded, his jaw tight, leaning against the wall as if distance might shield him from the unfolding scene. He had fought her bitterly for days, raged against the digging, against the gathering of neighbors, against the whispers that had reached town and refused to die. Yet now he stood silent, his eyes following every movement of the appraisers, his mouth opening once or twice only to close again. The weight of others' authority pressed on him harder than her defiance ever had. One of the experts lifted a bundle of bearer bonds, tilting it beneath the light, nodding to himself as he examined the ink, the embossing, the faint watermark that only trained eyes would catch. "Authentic," he said simply, his voice leaving no room for doubt. Another unfolded a gold certificate, his magnifying glass catching the fine print. "Pristine," he remarked. The third expert poured a handful of coins onto a cloth, the sound of gold against gold filling the barn with a music more convincing than any argument. "These alone," he murmured, "would change a family's fortune." Claire stood beside Dr. Bell, her heart pounding with each declaration. The historian's expression was grave, his hands clasped before him, but she caught the glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. Every word from the experts was a vindication, not only of his theories, but of her faith. She had been mocked, dismissed, told she was delusional. Now the truth was laid out under lamps and gloved hands, undeniable. Her husband shifted, his face flushed as the men spoke in figures and estimates, phrases like market value, auction potential, and conservative at $50 million. The sheriff, standing near the door, wrote notes in his small ledger, recording each word like it was testimony in court. The appraisers never once looked at her husband for approval, never asked his permission. They spoke to Claire, nodded to her, handed her documents with the deference given to the rightful custodian. She turned once, meeting his eyes. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. The lines in his face tightened, the smirk that had once accompanied his every word absent now. For years he had ridiculed her belief in the land, laughed at the ledger, torn papers in a show of contempt. But faced with experts, men he could not dismiss with a wave of the hand, he was left with nothing to say. His mockery dissolved in the silence that held him fast. The appraisers continued their work until the tables were covered in neat stacks and organized rows, every item recorded, every value noted. When they concluded, one of them closed his case with a decisive click and turned to Claire. "Mrs. Carson, I cannot overstate this. What you have here is historic, both in provenance and in value. You have protected it better than most institutions could have. This discovery will be studied for years." The words hung in the air. Claire felt her throat tighten, her hands trembling slightly, but she stood straight, her chin lifted. She thought of her grandmother's Bible, her grandfather's ledger, the stone slab sealed with iron clamps. She thought of every insult, every laugh, every moment her husband had tried to tear her down. All of it had led to this. Experts standing in her barn, confirming that her faith had unearthed truth. Her husband looked at her then, his face pale, his lips pressed in. No words came, only the recognition in his eyes that everything he had said, every cruel dismissal, had been stripped bare. He was silenced not by her defiance, but by the authority of others, by the weight of proof heavier than his pride could bear. The sheriff closed his ledger. The historian packed his notes, and the appraisers filed out into the dusk. The barn grew quiet again, the crates resting on the glow of fading lamps. Claire stood alone for a moment, her husband still leaning against the wall, mute and unmoving. She did not speak. She did not need to. The silence that wrapped around him was more final, more cutting, than any word she could ever deliver. And for the first time, he seemed to understand that the farm, the land, the legacy, everything he had mocked, was far greater than him. The barn was empty again by evening, the last of the appraiser's cars rolling away down the gravel lane, their headlights vanishing into the dark. The sheriff had left. Dr. Bell, too, carrying with him his notebook full of details that would surely one day appear in a published account. The neighbors had drifted back to their homes, their curiosity satisfied for now. Though Claire knew the whispers would grow with every retelling, only she and her husband remained, standing in the quiet barn with the crates stacked neatly along the walls. The electric lamps had been switched off, leaving only the glow of a single lantern on the work table. Its flame flickered over her face, steady and calm, though inside her chest her heart was still racing with the echo of the day. Her husband leaned against a post, arms crossed, his jaw tight but his eyes restless. He had not spoken since the appraisers left. The silence pressed between them like a wall, broken only by the occasional groan of the old timbers in the wind. Claire did not rush to fill it. She smoothed her hand across the rough lid of the nearest crate, her palm lingering on the faded stencil of the long-gone bank. She thought of her grandfather lowering these boxes into the earth, of her grandmother's careful note in the Bible, of the ledger that had guided her hands to this very spot. At last, she spoke, her voice low but even. "I never set out to prove you wrong. That was never my purpose." She lifted her eyes to him, steady and unblinking. "All I wanted was to honor what my family left behind. To treat this land as more than dirt to be sold, more than a burden. I knew there was meaning here, memory here. That's what I held on to." He shifted, his mouth opening as if to reply, but no words came. His face was caught between pride and shame, his hands twitching at his sides before returning to the safety of his folded arms. Claire turned back to the crate, running her fingers over the wood. "For generations, my family gave their lives to this soil. They endured droughts, floods, lean harvests, and still they stayed. People mocked them for it. Even you mocked me for it. But they weren't foolish. They were guardians. They kept something safe that was bigger than themselves, bigger than me. And all I did was listen. I followed the traces they left behind." Her voice softened, not with defeat, but with clarity. This was never about riches. "I don't care what number those men put on it. 50 million, 100 million. None of that matters as much as knowing my family was right. They remembered, and the land remembered with them. I just carried it forward." Her husband's eyes fell to the floor, the weight of her words hanging in the lantern glow. He had spent years mocking the land, calling it worthless, laughing at her stubborn faith. Now the crates stood as silent witnesses to his error, their presence undeniable, their contents authenticated by experts who had not needed convincing. Still, she did not gloat. She did not press her triumph against him. She spoke with the calm of someone who no longer needed to argue. "I only wanted to honor them," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. "To keep faith with the soil they walked, the house they built, the orchard they planted. That was all. If the world now sees value in what they left, then so be it. But for me, it has always been about memory. The barn seemed to exhale then, the silence deepening into something almost peaceful. Her husband looked at her, but she did not return his gaze. She remained with her hand resting on the crate, her eyes steady, her posture calm. The vindication was not loud, not triumphant. It was quiet, rooted in the stillness of knowing she had been right all along, that her family's story had not been erased, that the land had spoken on their behalf. And in that quiet, her husband finally had nothing left to say. The decision came quietly, without fanfare, as though it had been waiting in the soil all along. After the appraisers left and the newspapers began circling with questions she refused to answer, Claire sat at the kitchen table with the lockbox and ledger before her. The figures, 50 million, perhaps more, were written down in neat columns by strangers, but she refused to see them as mere numbers. To her, each sum represented a generation that had endured without asking for thanks. She thought of her grandfather bent over the fields, her grandmother's notes in the Bible, her father's calloused hands. The money was not hers to squander. It was a legacy meant to be returned to the land that had held it. The first step was the barns. They had leaned for years, tired shoulders stooped under weather and neglect. Crews came in trucks, their tools gleaming where rust once ruled, and slowly the timbers were lifted, braced, and restored. Fresh siding replaced rotted boards, but wherever possible, the old wood was saved, sanded, and oiled so that the memory of hands long gone remained visible. Neighbors stopped by to watch, their murmurs carrying across the fields. The barns no longer looked like relics waiting to fall, but like sentinels rising again, proud in their purpose. The fields came next. The east field, once mocked as barren, was tilled and reseeded. Its soil turned rich again under the guidance of experts who studied its composition and cared for it as carefully as Claire's grandfather once had. Orchards were pruned and replanted, young trees standing alongside the gnarled elders that had survived harsher years. Irrigation was added discreetly, hidden beneath the soil so that the land's face remained unchanged, but its lifeblood flowed stronger. Where weeds once stretched, rows of crops slowly returned, green against the horizon, proof that memory could become sustenance once more. Then came the farmhouse. Its paint, long chipped and faded, was scraped and renewed, though the color remained the same quiet white it had always been. Windows that rattled in the wind were repaired, panes replaced with care, so as not to lose the wavy glass that had witnessed so much. Inside, the sagging beams were reinforced, but the creak of the staircase was left untouched, a reminder of nights when children had crept up quietly so as not to wake their parents. New wiring and plumbing were added, but the old stove remained in the kitchen, its black iron polished until it shone like it once had under her grandmother's hand. The work was not carried out in secrecy, though Claire kept reporters at arm's length. Instead, it was done under the eyes of the town, with local craftsmen, masons, and carpenters hired first. Men and women who had known her family's name only as a synonym for stubbornness now found themselves restoring what that stubbornness had preserved. Some shook their heads, others smiled, but all felt the weight of what they were part of. When the work was complete, Claire stood in the center of the yard and looked around. The barn stood tall, the fields whispered with promise, the farmhouse gleamed without losing its scars. It no longer looked like a place abandoned to time, but like a living memory, stitched back together with care. She thought of her husband, still bitter in his silence, and wondered if he could see what she saw. That wealth meant nothing unless it was turned back into something that endured. At Dr. Bell's urging and with the sheriff's quiet guidance, she established a trust, one that would keep the farm intact, not as a monument to greed, but as a heritage site. It would remain in her family's name, but its gates would open to schools, to historians, to neighbors curious about the land that had hidden a fortune. The trust would ensure no investor could carve it into parcels. No developer could erase its story beneath asphalt and concrete. Claire signed the papers without hesitation. The ledger, the Bible, the letter, all had spoken of safeguarding, of trust, of memory kept alive. Now the land itself was safeguarded, its barns and fields no longer mocked but preserved, its farmhouse standing as both home and testament. The fortune had not been wasted on extravagance. It had been returned to where it belonged, to the soil that had held its secret with patience greater than any man's. And as she walked the field that evening, the sun setting low, she felt her grandparents' presence in every furrow, every stone, every creak of wood. The farm was restored, not simply in boards and paint, but in meaning. It was once again what it had always been meant to be, a place where memory endured, steady as the earth beneath her feet. The ledger had been waiting for her, as it always had, tucked into the drawer of the kitchen sideboard. Its cover was worn smooth, the leather dull by the touch of generations, its edges softened from being handled by hands now long gone. Claire pulled it out one evening after the workers had left. The fields outside quiet under the hush of dusk. The barn stood renewed, the farmhouse solid again, yet the heart of what had been uncovered was not in the paint or timber. It was in the memory that each page of that ledger carried, lines of ink that had recorded seed bought, debts repaid, storms endured, and hopes written in the plain language of survival. She opened it slowly, the spine creaking in a familiar protest. The first entries were her grandfather's, neat rows and steady handwriting, recording livestock sold, seed planted, whether noted with the precision of a man who knew his life depended on the whims of sky and soil. Later pages showed her father's hand, rougher, the script leaning more heavily as if written after long days in the field. There were margins filled with calculations, the occasional exclamation mark of triumph when a harvest yielded more than expected. Each page was a testament, not just to farming, but to endurance. Claire turned past the places where her own childhood scrawls had once been corrected by patient hands, and she paused at the last written entry, dated years before her father's death. It spoke of a poor harvest, corn blighted by rain, and yet there was no despair in the words, only the matter-of-fact note that the family would make do. Beyond that, the pages were empty, waiting. For years, she had been too afraid to add her own hand, believing she had nothing worthy of the space. But now the silence of those blank pages seemed to call her forward. The lantern on the table cast a circle of light across the paper. She dipped the pen, her fingers trembling slightly, though her heart was steady. The words came not as defiance, not as triumph, but as truth distilled from everything she had endured. She wrote slowly, carefully, the ink soaking into the paper as though it had been waiting for these very lines. Asterisk, worthless to some, but everything to us. Asterisk, the letter sat there, dark and sure, the last line in a book that had carried her family's memory across nearly a century. She laid the pen aside and rested her hand against the page, feeling the faint ridge of the ink beneath her fingertips. It was not a boast, not a declaration for the world. It was simply a closing thought offered to the past, an acknowledgement of those who had carried the weight of the land before her. Her husband had never returned to mock her again, not since the appraiser's verdict. He lived now in a silence of his own making, drifting to a farmhouse like a man who had seen the measure of his pride laid bare. But Claire did not write for him. She wrote for the grandfather who had hidden the letter in the barn beam, for the grandmother who had scribbled reminders in the margins of a Bible, for the farmers who had believed in soil others dismissed as spent. She wrote for herself, too, because she had carried their whispers when no one else would listen. Closing the ledger, she returned it to the drawer where it had always rested. Yet she knew this time was different. The line she had written would wait for whoever came next, just as her grandfather's lines had waited for her. The fortune buried in crates would one day be cataloged, studied, perhaps displayed. But the true inheritance was here. In a simple book, in a single sentence that carried the weight of everything the farm had meant. Outside, the field stretched dark and quiet, the soil cool beneath the night sky. Claire stood at the doorway, the air smelling faintly of cut grass and wood smoke. The land was no longer a question or a burden. It was memory made solid, history given roots. And now it was preserved, entrusted again, not to strangers or speculators, but to those who understood that worth was not always measured in dollars, that sometimes it lived only in the patience of soil and the ink of a ledger. The last line glowed in her mind as steady as the lantern's flame. Worthless to some, but everything to us. With that, the story of the Whitaker farm found its ending, not in wealth counted or land sold, but in the quiet truth of words written for memory's sake.